A stonemason's son, roaming the bustling Athenian marketplace and striking up a conversation with anybody willing to have one. His face likened to a satyr, broad nose, bulging eyes, walking barefoot in shabby clothes. Yet people stop and listen. This figure is Socrates. Despite, or perhaps because of, his self-depreciating claim, I know only that I know nothing. He sparked a revolution in thought. It was 399 BC that Socrates stood trial for his life, accused of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the city's gods. And instead of pleading for mercy, he used the opportunity to teach, challenging Athens one last time with his unwavering commitment to truth and virtue. But why exactly did this eccentric old man prefer death to abandoning his principles? To answer that is to go deep into the real teachings of Socrates. Lessons delivered not in formal lectures or books, but in relentless questions and an exemplary life. And that's what we're going to do today. Welcome to the channel, everyone. Talking about Socrates today. What exactly did he teach? We're going to explain it in the most simplistic manner that we can, so that we can all understand exactly what was going on. Now, first of all, thank you very much to those who have already clicked that like and subscribe button. For those who have not already done so, I assume that you will take the next few seconds to do so. Thank you in advance. And thank you once again to those who checked out the merch store and those supporting on the Patreon. Always good to see that, keeping the channel going. Now, without further ado and all the customary introductions out of the way, all out of good manners, of course, we can begin. Of course, the best place to start is by giving a little background on who Socrates actually was, for those who are new and for not quite familiar with him. So the story starts 470 BC in Athens, a time of cultural flowering and political turmoil. Socrates had lived through the golden age of Athens, but also the destructive Peloponnesian War. Unlike the typical image of a cloistered scholar, Socrates served as a hoplite, that is a foot soldier in the Athenian army, distinguishing himself with bravery in battles at Pontidea and Delium. Yet it was not military prowess or public office that made him famous. It was his distinct approach to philosophy. There's many paths to glory in ancient Greece. Philosophy was certainly one of them. Athens in the 5th century BC was teeming with new ideas, where sophists, the wandering professional teachers, promised to impart wisdom and success for a fee. However, Socrates seemed to have positioned himself quite differently. He claimed to possess no wisdom to sell, had a modest upbringing, and by some accounts trained in his father's craft of stonemasonry, and he never wrote a single word of philosophy. Instead, he made the streets of Athens his classroom, engaging ordinary citizens, politicians, craftsmen, and young aristocrats in dialogues about the deepest questions of human life. Socrates' era valued public debate and rhetoric, but he became notorious for turning conventional discussion on its head. He didn't lecture or proclaim grand theories about the cosmos. In fact, he often professed ignorance about many subjects, with a shrug of the shoulders. I don't know. Ask someone else, maybe. It takes a lot of guts to admit that. But what he did do was ask questions. He was great at starting conversations, getting people to think. Simple yet disarmingly profound questions like, what is virtue? What is justice? Those who stopped to talk with him often found themselves entangled in a rigorous examination of their own beliefs. It was through these conversations that Socrates developed a following of young students, fascinated by his charisma and intellect. Among them was Plato and, of course, Xenophon, who would later record his words and deeds. However, he also attracted suspicion and hostility from some of his fellow Athenians, who viewed his constant questioning as subversive. So to understand Socrates' teaching, we have to know our sources. Socrates wrote nothing himself, as we mentioned, so what we know comes from three main contemporaries. The first is Plato, of course. That is Socrates' most famous student, who wrote philosophical dialogues with Socrates as the central character. Plato's early works, like Apology or Euthyphro, are considered fairly reliable portrayals of Socratic thought, while later works tend to use Socrates as more of a mouthpiece for Plato's own ideas. Xenophon was another student of Socrates, a soldier and historian. His writings about Socrates, such as the Memorabilia and Apology, depict a more practical, plain-spoken teacher. His Socrates gives common-sense moral advice and engages in down-to-earth conversations, somewhat complementary to the image we get from Plato. And then, lastly, we have the playwright and contemporary of Socrates, Aristophanes, who lampooned him in a comedy called The Clouds. Aristophanes portrays Socrates as a caricature, a sophist and natural philosopher with his head literally in the clouds, which shows how some Athenians perceived Socrates' activities with either skepticism or some outright ridicule. But each source provides a different angle. Plato gives us the philosophical depth for Socratic thinking. Xenophon offers glimpses of Socrates' everyday interactions and personality, and Aristophanes reflects the public satire and, I suppose, the misunderstandings that Socrates had faced. So by triangulating these accounts, that is how we sketch the historical Socrates and his core teachings with a little bit more confidence. But we always have to be aware that we are seeing him through others' eyes and perhaps others' judgment. But if there is one singular thing that Socrates is famous for, it is his method of teaching. Rather than delivering sermons or writing treatises, Socrates taught by asking questions and engaging in dialogue. This approach, now known as the Socratic method, was his hallmark. He would begin by feigning ignorance, what is often called Socratic irony. For example, he might approach a self-assured politician or a reputed expert and say, "I know nothing about courage. Perhaps you can explain what courage really is." As the person attempted to define or explain the concept, Socrates would probe deeper with more questions. What do you mean by that? Is that true in all cases? Are there any exceptions? When the interlocutor offered an answer, Socrates examined it for logical consistency and clarity. Through this relentless questioning, Socrates exposed contradictions or gasps in his partner's knowledge. The immediate result was often called aporia, a state of puzzlement or impasse, where the person realizes they do not actually know what they thought they knew. Far from being mere intellectual showmanship, this was precisely Socrates' goal. He believed that recognizing one's own ignorance is the first step toward genuine understanding. He compared himself to a gadfly stinging the sluggish horse of Athens, irritating people in order to awaken them to reality. By unsettling complacent confidence, Socrates opened the way for true learning. I suppose for some people, it is very confronting when they're exposed for not being the reputed experts that they had thought themselves to be, and perhaps convinced many others that they were. You can see why Socrates was not universally popular, sure. So in practice, a typical Socratic dialogue, as described in Plato's early works, goes through stages. First, Socrates poses a big question, For example, what is justice? It's hard for us to explain it, isn't it, right? We all want justice. But define it. That's where Socrates comes in. Of course, somebody ventures an answer, and then Socrates asks clarifying questions, and perhaps proposes hypothetical situations to test the answer. Now, if there is inconsistencies emerging, the answer is refined, or a new one is proposed. The cycle repeats, often ending with the participants admitting that they have not yet found a satisfactory definition. This process is called elenchus, or cross-examination. While it can feel negative, since Socrates often disproved false beliefs without giving a final truth, Socrates saw it as profoundly constructive. It cleared away false knowledge, the illusion of understanding, and spawned a deeper quest for truth. An example of the Socratic method in action is found in Plato's dialogue Euthyphro. Socrates meets Euthyphro, a man confident that he knows all about piety, that is, holiness. Socrates, professing his own ignorance about what piety really means, asks Euthyphro to define it. Each definition Euthyphro gives, piety is what the gods love, for instance, prompts Socrates to examine the inconsistencies, raising the famous dilemma. Do the gods love the pious because it is pious, or is it pious because they love it? It's a good point. Either way, by the end, Euthyphro abandons the conversation in pure frustration, confidence surely shaken. But Socrates' goal wasn't to lord over people and humiliate them, but just to demonstrate that true wisdom begins by acknowledging how much you do not know. This question-driven pedagogy was radically different from the didactic teaching of the sophists. Socrates charged no fees and often drew no firm conclusions, whereas sophists were paid to deliver polished lectures or rhetoric. In fact, Socrates insisted that he was not a teacher at all in the conventional sense. He likened himself to a midwife even, helping others give birth to their own understanding. This maieutic or midwifery aspect of his method meant that knowledge had to come from within the student, through critical thinking and self-reflection. By refusing to spoon-feed answers, Socrates empowered his listeners to think for themselves. It's an approach that's still used in education and law schools today, at least the good ones, where instructors ask probing questions to develop students' reasoning rather than just telling them the facts. Now, you've got to remember that Socrates' questioning style was not some gimmick. It stemmed from a deep philosophical stance about knowledge itself. One of the most famous anecdotes about Socrates is the story of the Delphic oracle. According to Plato's Apology, Socrates' friend Chaerephon once asked the oracle of Delphi, that is, a priestess famed for prophetic utterances. I have a video on Greek oracles if you're interested. Whether anybody was wiser than Socrates, that was the question. The oracle replied that no one was wiser. Now, when Socrates heard this, he was pretty confused, since he never considered himself to be wise at all. Determined to understand the god's message, he set out to find someone wiser than himself, questioning prominent men who had a reputation for wisdom, politics, and also poets and craftsmen. But what he found was that while many people thought themselves to be wise, their understanding fell apart under careful examination. They believed they knew a great deal, but in truth, they did not. It was all surface level. Socrates realized that, paradoxically, he was the wisest, but only in the sense that he alone recognized his own ignorance. He concluded, I am wiser than this man. Neither of us probably knows anything worthwhile, but he thinks he knows something when he does not, whereas I, as I do not know anything, do not think that I do. Now, this insight is often summarized as the famous, "I know that I know nothing." It's become a cornerstone of Socratic thought, a statement of profound intellectual humility. Socrates was not literally claiming to know nothing at all, of course, but rather that he lacked the true wisdom about the ultimate truths. This awareness made him perpetually inquisitive and open-minded. It's the reason why he kept asking questions. Every conversation was an opportunity for both him and his interlocutor to inch closer to genuine knowledge, and that's definitely a conversation worth having. But importantly, Socrates also believed that acknowledging ignorance could protect one from false confidence and moral error. He saw pretensions to knowledge as dangerous. If a leader claims to know what justice is, but really does not, he might create unjust laws, thinking them to be righteous. Socrates' antidote was to always test and examine such claims. His skepticism about his own knowledge was not cynicism, not at all. It was more of a positive strategy for broad learning. By admitting, "I don't have any answers, let's find out together," he modeled an approach to truth that values constant inquiry over easy certainty. This attitude is the heart of what we now call the Socratic spirit, a combination of humility and relentless curiosity. And I hope that we can all be imbued with that spirit. But Socrates' intellectual humility was coupled with a kind of confidence in reason. He trusted that through disciplined questioning, humans could get closer to the truth. He devoted his life to this search. Even at his trial, when confronting the jury, Socrates did not abandon this stance. He famously told the court that if they offered to acquit him on the condition he stopped practicing philosophy, that he would refuse. Of course, we get another famous quote from this part of his life, which is, "The unexamined life is not worth living for a human being," was what he declared in his defense. To cease questioning and examining, to pretend one had all the answers, or to simply accept the dogmatic thought of the time, would be for Socrates worse than death anyway, or at least to live less than fully. It's a striking statement, delivered in the face of a possible death sentence. It shows how earnest Socrates was about the importance of continual inquiry and self-examination. While Socrates claimed not to have knowledge of astronomy or cosmology, or other subjects that the earlier philosophers pursued, he did have strong convictions about ethical matters. In fact, ancient writers like Aristotle credit Socrates with bringing philosophy down from the heavens, as in, well, making it focused more on ethics and human life, rather than things out of human spheres of control. Socrates was less interested in what the stars were made of, and far more interested in questions like, what is the right way to live? What is justice, courage, piety? Can virtue be taught? Things like this. These questions of moral philosophy were at the center of Socrates' conversations, and from the records we have, a distinctive ethical viewpoint emerges. At the heart of Socratic ethics is the idea that virtue and knowledge are intimately linked, even, in a sense, the same thing. Socrates repeatedly suggested that if a person truly knows what is good, he or she will do what is good. Conversely, all wrongdoing arises from ignorance. This claim is sometimes called the Socratic paradox, because it challenges our usual assumptions about weakness of will. Most people might say, I know what the right thing to do is, but I just don't do it. Socrates would respond that if you fail to do the right things, then you didn't really know, at least not in the full, proper sense of knowing what the right thing was. Perhaps you were aware of the right thing, but you did not fully understand the right thing. For Socrates, genuine knowledge isn't just about intellectual awareness. It penetrates one's character and motivates someone into right action. For example, in Plato's dialogue Protagoras, Socrates argues against the idea that someone can know the good but choose the bad. He insists that no one errs or does wrong willingly, another one of his famous maxims. Every person, he argues, naturally desires what they believe is good for them. If they do evil or make harmful choices, it must be because they are mistaken. They actually believe at some level what they're doing will bring some good or happiness, even if they're wrong about it. In short, all evil is the result of ignorance. This is a radically intellectualist view of morality. Becoming a better person is fundamentally about becoming wiser. To know justice is to act justly. To know courage is to act courageously. And from this perspective, the cultivation of virtue is the cultivation of knowledge, not technical or scientific knowledge, but a deep understanding of the knowledge of what is truly good. Are you staying with me? Well, Socrates often emphasized caring for one's soul, that is the seat of wisdom and character, above all worldly concerns. According to Plato's Apology, Socrates told the jurymen that his divine mission was to persuade them to care not for wealth or reputation, but for virtue and wisdom first and foremost, saying, quote from the Apology, "Wealth does not bring goodness, but goodness brings wealth and every other blessing, both to the individual and to the state." This conviction that moral virtue is the highest good colored every single aspect of Socrates' life and teaching. So let's just summarize some key principles, just so we're very, very clear on everything. Ones that Socrates taught about ethics and virtues. First, it is that virtue is the highest good. Moral excellence is more valuable than fame, power, or money, and a virtuous soul is your most precious possession. The next is that virtue is knowledge. True goodness requires true understanding. If you genuinely know what is right, you will do what is right. No one errs willingly. Everyone naturally desires what they think is good. If a person acts wrongly, it is only because they are mistaken or ignorant about what good truly is. Also, it's better to suffer than to do wrong, or suffer wrong than to do wrong, pardon me. That is, committing an injustice harms your soul, which is worse than any harm you might suffer as a victim. Therefore, one must never do wrong, even in return. And lastly, the unexamined life is not worth living. Living ethically requires constant self-reflection. Socrates believed that only by continually examining your beliefs and actions we can keep our souls aligned with virtue and truth. The ideas themselves might sound a little abstract, but Socrates made them concrete through dialogues. For instance, in Plato's Crito, we see Socrates in prison after being sentenced to death. His wealthy friend Crito offers to finance an escape and urges Socrates to flee and save his life. But Socrates refuses. He doesn't base his refusal on simple loyalty to the city or a death wish. Instead, he engages Crito in a discussion about justice and injustice. Socrates leads Crito to agree that doing wrong is never justified, even if one has been wronged. So escaping from prison would violate the laws and harm the city that raised him, which Socrates sees as an unjust act. So he concludes that it is better to accept the unjust verdict than to commit an injustice himself by breaking the laws. So this exemplifies his commitment to the principle that one must never do evil, even in response to evil, a commitment born from his belief that maintaining virtue, justice, is more important than any other consequence. Socrates' stance that virtue is knowledge was later criticized by philosophers like his pupil Plato, who in later works recognized that people can act against their better knowledge, and also by Aristotle, who developed the concept of akrasia, that is, weakness of will. Yet Socrates' bold assertion was meant to jolt his contemporaries into rethinking morality. If all people really seek the good, then moral education is the crucial task, and ignorance, that's the true enemy. Socrates devoted himself to fighting that ignorance. He didn't merely want to win arguments. He wanted his interlocutors to become better. Xenophon's accounts often highlight this aspect. Socrates is a moral guide who tries to cure the perplexities of his friends and lead them toward more virtuous lives. In Xenophon's Memorabilia, we see Socrates tutoring companions on self-discipline, responsibility, and justice in very practical terms, always steering them to see that understanding the good leads to doing the good. Socrates seems to have seen himself as having a kind of divine mission. He famously likened himself to a gadfly stinging a great but sluggish horse, that being the Athenian state, preventing it from becoming complacent. In his trial speech, Apology, Socrates explains that by pestering people with questions and goading them to think, he is actually doing the city a service, keeping it awake morally and intellectually. This was not a role he sought for fame or pleasure. He believed he was guided by a divine calling. Socrates mentions a peculiar inner voice or sign, his daimonion, which he experienced as a sort of spiritual intuition that would warn him when he was about to take a wrong step. Interestingly, this inner voice never told him what to do. It only stopped him from doing certain things. He notes that it often fell silent when he was on the right path. He took the existence of this guiding voice as evidence that he was meant to live the life of a philosopher in the way he did. The idea of the examined life flows directly from Socrates' mission, because he believed that care of the soul through pursuit of wisdom and virtue was the highest duty. He practiced and preached constant self-examination and discussion. When he says the examined life is not worth living, he's emphasizing that a life without reflection, where one simply follows the crowd or adheres to uncritically accepted beliefs, is a waste of time and potential. For Socrates, every person has the capacity and even the responsibility to reflect on questions like, what is my life aiming at, and are my beliefs justified? Only through such reflection can one improve their soul. In Plato's Apology, Socrates recounts how he went around questioning people as service to the gods following the oracle's pronouncement. He admits this behavior earned him quite a lot of hostility, as nobody likes to have their ignorance revealed, of course. Yet he persisted, believing that provoking thought was the greatest good he could do for others. He says to the jury, I shall never cease from the practice and teaching of philosophy, exhorting anyone whom I meet, saying, are you not ashamed of caring so much for money and fame and ambition, when you neither think nor care about wisdom and truth and the perfection of your soul? This captures Socrates' mission in his own words, to remind his fellow citizens to prioritize their state of their soul, their moral and intellectual integrity over material concerns. It's worth noting, though, that Socrates was not universally appreciated as a noble gadfly, that's for sure. Many Athenians felt stung in less positive ways. To those he publicly embarrassed, I suppose exposing their ignorance on a grander scale, he was a nuisance, or even a dangerous influence on the youth, since many young Athenians enjoyed watching venerable figures being reduced to confusion by Socrates' questions. Over the years, these tensions built up. Athenians, proud of their wisdom or status, didn't take kindly to this strange man exposing their ignorance. And indeed, some of Socrates' own followers became controversial. Alcibiades, yes, that one, a brilliant but treacherous politician in general, had been close to Socrates in his youth, and Critias, one of the violent 30 tyrants who briefly overthrew Athenian democracy, had also associated with Socrates. By 399, 3 citizens, Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon, brought formal charges against Socrates for, quote, not recognizing the gods the city recognizes, introducing new divinities, and corrupting the youth, which was effectively a trial of Socrates' way of life and teaching. Socrates met his trial with the same steadfast commitment to his principles that he had shown all his life. He defended himself by explaining his mission and questioning his accusers in turn. Famously, rather than ingratiate himself with the jury, he maintained an unapologetic tone. When found guilty, he was given a chance to propose a lesser penalty than death. In a bit of a characteristic irony, he suggested that far from punishing him, the city should reward him with free meals for life at the town hall, the sort of honor given to an Olympic champion, because in his view, he really had helped Athens by challenging its citizens to think. Of course, this did not amuse the jury. They didn't see the joke, I suppose. Juries are not known for their good humor, and it likely contributed to the vote for the death penalty. However, Socrates was not being flippant. He genuinely believed in the positive value of his philosophic mission. One of the official accusations against Socrates was impiety, that is, failing to acknowledge the city's gods or introducing new ones. And this charge is pretty interesting because Socrates often spoke about the gods and was notably guided by a spiritual inner voice. So how did Socrates conceive of piety and the divine? The evidence is somewhat mixed and comes primarily from Plato's Euthyphro and Apology, along with Xenophon's writings. We'll start with Euthyphro. Now, as mentioned earlier, Socrates questions Euthyphro on the nature of piety or holiness. Though the dialogue ends, without a clear definition, as per usual, Socrates' probing questions suggest that he was not satisfied with a simple "what the gods like" answer. It must be deeper than that, and he was searching for a more rational principle of piety beyond the capricious wills of the traditional Greek pantheon. Socrates certainly did not outright deny the existence of the gods. In fact, in the Apology, he cites his own philosophical mission as something ordained by them, as per the Delphic oracle's message, and references his daimonion as kind of a divine sign. It implies he had a very personal sense of divine guidance, and you can't really have that while being an atheist, now can't you? What Socrates likely rejected was a conventional storytelling about the gods which perceived them as immoral or petty. He was accused of introducing new divinities, possibly because of his talk of the inner voice, or because he spoke of the god's will, perhaps interpreting the oracle's pronouncement in a monotheistic way. His defense in Apology to the impiety charge was that he does believe in gods after all. He acknowledges spiritual agencies like the daimonion, and one cannot believe in spiritual matters without having a solid belief in the spirit world. Thus he argued that the charge itself was contradictory. Socrates' reverence for the divine was intertwined with his political and philosophical quest. He seemed to believe that the gods wanted him to pursue and encourage virtue. In Xenophon's Memorabilia, there is an account of Socrates reasoning with a skeptic about the existence of gods. Socrates points to the evident order and beneficial design in the world. Our eyes are adapted to see, ears to hear. Cycles of nature support life, arguing that such grand design implies a wise and benevolent designer. This argument from design is quite a sophisticated theological reasoning for the time, suggesting Socrates had a more philosophical conception of a deity than the average Athenian. Rather than focusing on rituals and sacrifices, Socrates emphasized living rightly as the true way to honor the divine. He was known to participate in the customary religious practices of Athens, For example, he served on the council, and when he happened to preside over a trial, he refused to break his oath even under pressure, which could be seen as a pious respect for law and justice. And, touching on a pretty poignant detail, in Plato's work Phaedo, which describes Socrates' final moments, it notes that Socrates' last words were to ask a friend to sacrifice a rooster to Asclepius, the god of healing, a gesture that could be interpreted as Socrates symbolically thanking the god for a cure, perhaps meaning death as a cure for all the ills of life. So even at the end, Socrates kept one foot in traditional piety, while philosophically reinterpreting what true piety meant. But I suppose that was the problem. It wasn't pious in a sense that people were satisfied with. And so I suppose, in summary, Socrates had taught a form of piety that was deeply ethical. The gods are wise and good, so the best way to honor them is to seek wisdom and goodness. He challenged shallow or literalist views of religion, steering conversations to questions of moral truth, things people could engage with on a human level. But that approach, however, was not easily understood by all, and it contributed to the suspicion that he was indeed impious. His conviction was likely less about an actual irreligion and more about politics and personal vendettas. But it does show that his philosophical mission put him at odds with many traditionalists. But then we have the situation of Socrates' interactions with these sophists, a different kind of teacher. Sophists of Athens were the educators for hire of Socrates' day. If you wanted a teacher, that's who you'd go to. They taught politics, rhetoric, and virtue as they claimed to anyone who could pay, often promising success in public life as the outcome of their teachings. Sophists like Protagoras, Hippias, and Gorgias were a celebrity of a sort, flashy, well-compensated, and sometimes viewed with suspicion for their relativistic or materialistic ideas. Socrates was frequently lumped together with the sophists in the public mind. After all, he too dealt with philosophical questions, and had young followers hanging on his every word. But Socrates was not happy with this association. He took pains to distinguish himself from them, and understanding this difference is key to grasping what Socrates really taught. So first and foremost, Socrates did not take money for conversation. This was not just a quirk, it was a reflection of his belief that wisdom was not a commodity to be sold, and that teaching virtue for a fee undermines the sincerity of the enterprise. He lived a life of relative poverty, which gave moral credibility to his message. He clearly was not in it for material gain. Now, secondly, the sophists were often relativists about truth and morality. For example, Protagoras famously said, "Man is the measure of all things," implying that truth is subjective and varies from person to person. In contrast, Socrates, at least as portrayed by Plato and Xenophon, was convinced that there are objective truths to be found in virtues and justice. His constant asking of what is X, what is Y, presupposed that X has a real nature or definition, while a sophist might teach you how to make the weaker argument appear stronger, a skill useful in law courts irrespective of the truth, by the way. Socrates was interested in making the weaker soul stronger by leading it to the truth. He was deeply concerned with genuine definitions, not merely persuasive definitions. Another difference was purpose. Sophists aimed to equip students with skills, especially rhetorical ones, to achieve success, power, or worldly ends. Socrates aimed to improve souls. This is why sometimes he irked those in power. He would question their moral knowledge rather than teach them tricks to get their way. Socrates didn't claim to have all the answers, but sophists often did, selling their supposed wisdom. Socrates insisted on questioning assumptions. Sophists, by contrast, were sometimes seen as reinforcing whatever assumptions would win an argument for their client. The confusion between Socrates and the Sophists was not helped by Aristophanes' satire in the Clouds. In that play, Socrates is depicted as running a thinkery, where hapless students learn ridiculous logical fallacies and natural sciences, like measuring how high a flea can jump, or how to argue one's way out of debt. Which, hey, I think that's a pretty good skill. While the comedic Socrates teaches a young man to disrespect his parents and twist arguments. This was a distorted parody, sure, very obvious, but Athenians who saw the play might have believed that Socrates was just another sophist, or something worse than that. Socrates addressed this in his apology, noting that he's been maligned by caricature for years, and that his accusers are capitalizing on that mistaken image. But in reality, Socrates' teaching style and aims were fundamentally at odds with the sophistic approach. He even disclaimed being any kind of teacher at all. In the sense of imparting knowledge, he was more like a catalyst. A modern analogy might be a mentor who insists you learn by doing and thinking, rather than handing you a manual and wishing you the best of luck. Socrates would accompany somebody in the search of truth, not claim to have packaged truth ready to deliver. Now, that being said, Socrates did engage in sophists in conversation. Plato's dialogues, Protagoras and Gorgias, show Socrates debating these figures. In those texts, we see Socrates challenging the sophists on whether virtue can be taught, and what virtue even means, and on whether rhetoric without concern for truth is morally acceptable. These dramatized debates show Socrates' difference. He continually presses for clarity and moral responsibility, whereas his opponents often end up revealing that they prioritize winning or expediency over the truth. So to sum it up, Socrates taught against the prevailing cynicism and relativism of the sophists. He believed in an absolute sense of justice and virtue, and it was worth pursuing, but quite difficult to pin down. He taught by example that a life spent seeking the truth and goodness was superior to a life spent chasing power or indulging in clever persuasion. In a way, he was a moral counterweight to the sophists, emphasizing integrity and wisdom over success at any cost. So, why not, for a bit of fun before we go, talk about a few anecdotes about his life that are equally illuminating and I think bring his teachings to life too. Of course, he's known for his philosophical ideas, but there's more to it than that. He did not separate philosophy from how he lived. He was the message he delivered in many respects. So consider these few glimpses of Socrates, which reveal a man of paradoxical and endearing quality. First, unlike the stereotypical intellectual, Socrates was physically hardy. He went everywhere barefoot, and apparently thought little of material comfort. In Plato's Symposium, the handsome general Alcibiades describes Socrates on a military campaign. During the bitter winter at Potidaea, Socrates walked barefoot on the ice, while others bundled up, yet he seemed completely untroubled by the cold. He also had astonishing powers of concentration. One story tells that Socrates once stood stock still in meditation from dawn throughout the entire day and night, thinking about a problem, much to the astonishment of his fellow soldiers. And in battle, he showed true courage. Alcibiades recounts how Socrates saved his life during a retreat, and even when the enemy was at rout at the Battle of Delium, Socrates withdrew calmly and in control, possibly preventing panic among the Athenians. A delightful, lesser-known side of Socrates appears in Xenophon's Symposium, not Plato's Symposium, Xenophon's. At a dinner party, after watching a skilled young dancer perform, Socrates good-natured attempts a few dancers' steps himself. In fact, a friend teased that he'd seen Socrates dancing alone in the early morning. Socrates didn't deny it. He cheerfully explained that he often practiced a bit of dancing at dawn as a form of exercise to keep fit and freshen the appetite. The image of the aged, pot-bellied philosopher dancing by himself in his house, simply for the joy and the health of it, is quite enduring. It kind of breaks the mold of Socrates being this stern moralist. And it reminds us that for Socrates, care of the soul didn't exclude taking care of the body in that simple, balanced way, and that joy and playfulness were all part of a well-lived life too. Now what about his family and personal relationships? Well, Socrates was married. In fact, some sources say he had 2 wives, Xanthippe being the most famous, and possibly a second named Myrto, though that is less historically certain. Xanthippe has come down through legend as the archetype of a shrewish wife, and many colourful anecdotes depict her temper clashing with Socrates' equanimity. The most famous story is that one day Xanthippe scolded Socrates harshly in public, and in a fit of frustration dumped an entire pot of water over his head. Instead of reacting angrily, Socrates took it in his stride with a witty remark, "After the thunder comes the rain." I'm sure his wife saw the humor in that, or whether it's true or not, it highlights Socrates' calm humor in domestic life. He himself explained, as per Xenophon, that he chose to marry Xanthippe because dealing with her spirited temperament was good training, much like a horseman choosing a feisty and unruly horse to improve his skill, and he joked that by learning to live with Xanthippe, he could get along with anyone. Well, I'm sure that poor old Xanthippe appreciates the romantic sentiment. Well, she mustn't have been too opposed to it, because they had 3 sons. But by Socrates' own admission, he didn't do much in raising them. His mind was always set on other things. Still, he showed affection. In Plato's Phaedo, we see Socrates briefly comfort his weeping friends, and even his distraught wife, whom he gently asked to be led away so he can meet his death calmly. It paints a picture of a man who, while philosophically single-minded, still cared about others on a human level. Taken together, it reinforces the coherence with these antidotes between Socrates' teachings and his life. He valued self-control and demonstrated it through personal endurance and temperament. He valued humor and perspective, never taking himself too seriously, and he tried to act according to the virtues he discussed. His life was his final teaching. When Socrates at age 70 drank the cup of hemlock poison at his execution, he did so with remarkable composure, discussing philosophy, the immortality of the soul with his disciples until the very end. He even censured his friends for crying, gently asking them to let him die in peace. In doing so, he showed that for him, death was certainly not the worst evil, but wrongdoing was. And so he faced his death with the peace of someone whose conscience was clear, and whose soul was, in his view, ready for whatever would come next. And so we see that Socrates taught not only through doctrines, but through example and dialogue, and that's a legacy that's profoundly shaped the entire concept of Western thought. His actual teachings can be distilled into a few powerful ideas that I want you to remember. Examine your life. Know that you do not know. Seek virtue through understanding, and never compromise your moral integrity. He challenged those around him to question everything, define their terms, and live by principle. In an academic sense, he revolutionized philosophy by focusing on ethics and how one ought to live, but his style was still accessible. He spoke in the marketplace free of charge, used analogies from everyday life, and possessed a sharp wit. This is why we can imagine him giving a university lecture today. I suppose it'd be pretty unpredictable, but intellectually rigorous, probably filled with that plain-spoken humor. And so the historical Socrates emerges as a man of irony and paradox, wise because he knew his own ignorance, influential while claiming no authority, deeply rational yet guided by a divine inner voice, and condemned as a criminal. Yet history remembers him as a martyr for truth. I wonder if those on the jury saw that coming. His teachings force us to confront our own beliefs and ask, as he did, what is a good life for a human being? In hearing Socrates' story and ideas, we're effectively being invited into one of his conversations, and it's a conversation that has continued for over 2,000 years. Each of us, examining in our life, becomes a student of Socrates. Perhaps that's his most enduring teaching at all, that philosophy is not reserved for academics and specialists, but it's a way of living that's open to anyone. As long as you're willing to think critically, that's all you need. Well, that's it from me. Thank you so much for joining me again today. It's been a pleasure talking about Socrates. You know, in the spirit of Socrates, I suppose it's that the main question of this entire talk, what did Socrates actually teach? Well, that is, I suppose, a Socratic question in itself. What is the Socratic method? What is Socratic philosophy? Well, I hope you know now. Plato. He never steps forward in his dialogues to clearly announce, "This is my doctrine," but rather hides behind the voices of characters, most famously his teacher Socrates. This literary choice has tantalized readers for over 2,000 years. It's almost as if we're eavesdropping on conversations in ancient Athens, left to deduce Plato's ideas from his witty debates and mythic stories. But we still have the question, ultimately, what did Plato himself teach? There must be an answer. And to get that answer, we have to become somewhat philosophical detectives, sifting through dialogues rich with drama, irony, and insight, to uncover the convictions of the man who founded the academy and ultimately shaped Western thought. So imagine yourself sitting there in Plato's academy garden, under the shade of those olive trees, listening to the master engage his students. What grand ideas can emerge? We're going to go back and journey through Plato's own philosophy as expressed in his writings, leaving aside the historical Socrates and focusing solely on Plato's vision. From the nature of reality and knowledge, to the immortal soul, to the ideal society, and the power and peril of art, we'll trace the arc of Plato's teachings together. And while we're doing it, we'll uncover a few vivid anecdotes that give us further insight. Plato's brush with the tyrant that nearly cost him his life, the mystical initiation into philosophy via love, and even Plato's sly warnings about the dangers of writing things down. We'll explain them all, but the goal is not just to list Plato's doctrines. We have to engage with them critically, noting how his ideas develop and sometimes conflict across different dialogues. And of course, like any good conversation, we'll try not to weigh it down with jargon. This exploration together today will be structured, sure, but we'll keep it as accessible as possible. So, Step into the proverbial classroom of Plato, and I'm sure some wisdom awaits. But before we do, let me welcome you to the channel. Any newcomers? Let me know in the comments. And for those coming back, it's always a pleasure to see you again. Back to the ancient world. Thank you so much to those who are supporting on the Patreon, and those who checked out the merch store. Lots of nice little mugs and t-shirts and all that, little goodies on there. Certainly helps keep the channel going. Well, with all the like and subscribe nonsense out of the way, let's just get on with the video, shall we? Nice and relaxed. 427 to 347 BC. Plato. He did not write treatises or lecture notes. Rather, he wrote dialogues, philosophical dramas where characters discuss and argue. So let's set the scene of his teachings. Chief among these characters is the great Socrates, the revered mentor. Yet it's crucial to distinguish the historical Socrates from Plato's Socrates. In early dialogues like Apology or Euthyphro, Socrates often appears as a questioner, claiming ignorance. But as Plato's own thinking matured, Socrates becomes a mouthpiece for bold theories that likely in reality actually belonged to Plato himself. And then we have Aristotle, Plato's own student, who later indicated that Plato inserted his doctrines under Socrates' name. So, Plato's teachings are embedded in the dramatic conversations that he crafted. His method was partly pedagogical. Plato believed truth emerges through dialectic, a back and forth of reasoned dialogue, rather than the one-sided lecture. Everybody has to get involved in some point, then we can all have a big discussion and finally get to the bottom of things, rather than everybody just shutting up and listening to the, quote, teacher. One near-contemporary account tells us that Plato once composed poems and even tragedies in his youth. But after meeting Socrates, he burned those works to dedicate himself entirely to the field of philosophy. Instead of epic poetry, Plato poured his literary genius into philosophical dialogue. The result is that reading Plato is like watching a play of ideas. We see definitions proposed and dismantled, thought experiments, myths, and rigorous arguments, all presented in this dialogue form. But this raises a bit of a puzzle for us. How exactly do we extract and identify Plato's own views from the dialogues? Well, we have a little bit of a clue, and one clue is to look at recurring themes and conclusions in dialogues written during Plato's middle and later years. For example, dialogues such as Republic, Phaedo, Symposium, and Phaedrus present positive doctrines, like the theory of forms, the immortality of the soul, etc., just as two examples. In contrast, some earlier dialogues end in aporia, that is, no definitive answer, and this reflects Socrates' method of exposing ignorance. Scholars generally agree that Plato used Socrates as a character to develop his own philosophy, especially after Socrates' death. Plato's student, Aristotle, frankly credits Plato and the Pythagoreans with doctrines about abstract forms and mathematical principles, which go, frankly, far beyond anything that the real Socrates taught. Now, if you're interested in everything that Socrates had taught about, I've done a full video on him about a week back, I believe. Well, of course, before diving into these ideas, a quick note on Plato's life and influence, because, of course, his experiences and the intellectual milieu shaped what he taught. Plato was born to an aristocratic Athenian family, and was a young man when he became a follower of Socrates. He lived through the tumultuous years of the Peloponnesian War and its aftermath, witnessing Athens' political instability and the execution of Socrates in 399 BC. These events left a deep imprint. Plato became disillusioned with the flawed Athenian democracy that killed his mentor, and this is reflected in his sharp critiques of democratic leadership in the Republic. After the death of Socrates, Plato picked up and travelled widely. Ancient reports said he went to Megara, Cyrene in North Africa, to study with a mathematician, Italy to mingle with Pythagorean philosophers, and even Egypt to converse with priests. Journeys such as this, of course, exposed him to diverse ideas, Heraclitan flux, Pythagorean mathematics and mysticism, Egyptian lore. Diogenes Laertius, a biographer writing centuries later, even claims, quote, he mixed together the doctrines of Heraclitus, the Pythagoreans, and Socrates. From Heraclitus, he took the notion that the sensible world is not in constant change, or rather is in constant change, From Pythagoras, the idea of an intelligible realm and number of harmony, and from Socrates, the focus on ethics and politics. Whether literally true or not, certainly shows that Plato's philosophy is a grand synthesis, anchoring Socratic ethics within a broader metaphysical system influenced by earlier thinkers. So we begin from the core of Plato's teachings, and that is the Socratic imperative to examine one's life and values. In Plato's Apology, that dramatic recreation of Socrates' trial, Socrates, and through him Plato, delivers a powerful message. That is, to talk every day about virtue and other things is the greatest good to man, and that the unexamined life is not worth living. I'm sure you've heard that famous line. It's perhaps one of the most famous lines in philosophy, and it really encapsulates the starting point of Platonic philosophy in general, that a life should be devoted to seeking wisdom and understanding oneself, rather than chasing money or status blindly. And so we work from there. I suppose it's a general starting point for all philosophy, that point of inquiry. But Plato taught that true virtue and happiness are achieved through knowledge and self-reflection. In that same speech, Socrates/Plato says that he has spent his life persuading young and old, quote, not to care for your persons or your property more than for the perfection of your souls, insisting that virtue does not come from money, but rather money and all other good things have to come from virtue. Here, we get a distinctly Platonic moral, that moral virtue is the highest good, and material success is worthless if one's soul or character is corrupt. Of course, if we place ourselves in the Athens of the time, it's quite a radical stance, where many prioritized political power or wealth over everything else. Plato's teachings consistently prioritize the health of the soul and virtue above external advantage, and he inherited this value from Socrates, but he made it the bedrock of his own philosophy. However, Plato would not be content with simply exhorting people to be virtuous. He wanted to understand what virtue is, and how it can be known or taught. This, of course, leads us to one of his early and persistent questions, and that is, can virtue be taught? But more fundamentally, what is knowledge? In dialogues like Meno and Protagoras, Socrates debates whether qualities like justice or courage are teachable. The dialogue Meno begins with Meno asking if virtue can be taught, only for Socrates to steer the discussion to a more basic puzzle. How can we search for something if we don't know what it is? This is, of course, the famous Meno's paradox. If we know what we're looking for, then inquiry is unnecessary. But if we don't, inquiry is impossible. But Plato does not leave us in this paradox. He introduces one of his important doctrines as a solution, the theory of recollection. In Meno, Socrates proposes that learning is essentially recollection of knowledge that our soul possessed before birth. He suggests that the soul is immortal and has seen all truths. So what seems like learning something new is actually remembering something old. Let's demonstrate it. Plato includes a now famous scene. Socrates guides an uneducated servant boy through a geometry problem. By only asking questions, Socrates elicits correct answers from the boy, who had no formal training. Now this, as Socrates claims, shows that the boy had latent knowledge of geometry, awakened by his questioning. A quote from the work from Socrates. The soul, then, as being immortal, and having been born again many times, has knowledge of many things. So all inquiry and all learning is but recollection. Through this, admittedly, poetic myth, whether it be apocryphal or not, Plato teaches that human minds have innate knowledge of fundamental truths, especially if we're talking about mathematical and ethical truths. Discovering them is simply a matter of recalling, through proper questioning, what the soul already knows at some deep level. You just have to have somebody come along and knock on the right door of the mind. And this idea elevates knowledge beyond mere sensory experience. True knowledge is a priori, rooted in the soul's acquaintance with external realities. And this connects with another core of Platonic teaching, that distinction between knowledge and opinion. In several dialogues, notably the Republic and Theaetetus, Plato explores what genuine knowledge, called episteme, where we get our word epistemology from. He explores what this genuine knowledge is, as opposed to mere belief or opinion, called doxa. Knowledge, for Plato, has to be certain, unchanging, and tied to reality. Opinion, by contrast, can be true or false, and is often based on the shifting world of appearances. In Book 6 of the Republic, Plato illustrates this with the analogy of the divided line. Imagine a line divided into sections representing different degrees of clarity in our cognition. The lowest is imagination, seeing shadows. Above that belief, seeing physical things, then mathematical reasoning, and highest of all of them, dialectical understanding of the forms. Knowledge proper, he argues, is of external truths. The forms, more on those in a moment, whereas what we get through the senses is best a matter of opinion, because the sensory world is in flux and our perceptions can deceive us. Thus, Plato essentially taught that philosophy's task is to ascend from opinion to true knowledge. Now, how do we do that? Through disciplined inquiry and dialectic, turning the mind away from sensory distractions toward the unchanging realities. This is dramatized beautifully in Plato's allegory of the cave, that is Republic, Book 7. Socrates asks us to picture prisoners in a dark cave, chained so they can only see the wall in front of them. And behind them, a fire burns. Between the fire and the prisoners, objects are paraded, casting shadows upon the wall. The prisoners take these shadows as the only reality. They've never seen anything else. But suppose one prisoner is freed and dragged up out of the cave into sunlight. At first the light overwhelms him. He's confused and blinded. But slowly, he acclimates. He sees reflections in water, and then real objects, and finally, he can gaze at the sun itself. This individual is now enlightened. He realizes that the sun is the source of light and life, just as, in Plato's analogy, the form of the good is the ultimate source of truth and being. Now think about it. If this freed individual returns to the cave, his eyes would struggle in the dark, and his former comrades might think that the journey had made him crazy. They might even kill anyone who tried to free them, preferring the familiar shadows. Plato uses this allegory to teach multiple lessons, that most people live in a world of illusions, mistaking sensory appearances for reality. That education is a difficult but transformative journey upward to true reality and knowledge, and that the enlightened philosopher, who grasps the truth, often faces misunderstandings or even outright hostility if they go back to help others. The allegory shows one of Plato's most important teachings, the existence of a higher reality beyond the physical world, which is grasped by the intellect and not by the senses. And so, when the escaped prisoner finally sees the sun, Socrates explains, quote, "In the world of the knowledge, the last thing to be perceived, and only with great difficulty, is the idea of the good. But when seen, it must be concluded that this is the cause of all that is right and beautiful, the progenitor of light, and the lord of light in this visible world, and the immediate source of reason and truth in the intelligible world." Well, in other words, the ultimate object of knowledge is the form of the good, which, once you find that, it illuminates all other truths. This brings us to the famous theory of forms, which is arguably the centerpiece of Plato's philosophy. So now we'll talk about that. And quite frankly, if there is one doctrine that defines Plato's entire philosophical teaching, it is his theory of forms, or ideas. Let's look at it in plain terms. Plato taught that beyond the imperfect physical things we perceive, there exist perfect, unchanging archetypes or essences, and these, of course, are called forms. Everything we see in the material world, trees, chairs, people, acts of justice, etc., is what it is by participating in a corresponding form. The form is the true reality. The particular object is a fleeting approximation. So Plato didn't present this theory in a single, tidy chapter. Rather, it's introduced through examples and arguments across dialogues. In the work Phaedo, the dialogue set on Socrates' last day alive, Socrates argues for the soul's immortality, and along the way invokes forms. He asks why, for instance, we say 2 sticks are equal in length. The sticks might differ slightly, or could appear unequal from another angle. Yet we have the concept of perfect equality itself. Socrates suggests that the sticks are equal because they participate in the form of equality, which is absolute and unchanging. Something our soul must have known before birth, since from the moment we first see roughly equal things as children, we recognize a standard we've never perfectly observed within our senses. This is a subtle argument that universals like equality or beauty are real things, not just names. Furthermore, in the Republic, Plato illustrates the forms within the analogy of the sun and the divided line, which we touched on, and of course of the cave. Socrates compares the form of the good to the sun. Just as the sun illuminates objects so that our eyes can see them, the good illuminates the form so that our minds can know them. In other words, the form of good is the ultimate source of intelligibility and reality. And on the divided line, all the way up at the top, are the forms. Object of intellect, it's nous rather than doxa, opinion. Plato's forms are eternal, unchangeable, and non-physical essences of things. For example, all beautiful things are beautiful insofar as they partake of the form of beauty itself. All just actions, rather, are just by partaking of justice itself. A triangle drawn in sand is an imperfect instance of a triangle itself, the perfect geometrical form of a triangle. I know, it sounds a little abstract, and I think Plato was pretty aware that it would strike people as strange. You see, in the dialogue Symposium, rather than a dry argument, he gives us a moving image of the ascent to the forms, that being the ladder of love. There, Socrates recounts a lesson from a wise woman named Diotima on the true meaning of love, in Greek eros. Love, Diotima says, starts with physical attraction to a beautiful body, but if one is guided correctly, one realizes that the beauty of one body is akin to the beauty of another. One learns to appreciate the beauty in all bodies. Then the beauty in souls, character, virtues over physical beauty, and then the beauty of institutions and laws, and the beauty of knowledge. Finally, the lover of beauty, quote, ever climbing aloft, comes to know the very essence of beauty itself. Diotima describes this ultimate vision in an ecstatic tone. Quote from the work, he beholds beauty itself, eternal, absolute, simple, and everlasting, which neither comes into being nor passes away, existing ever in singularity of the form by itself, while all the other beautiful things partake of it. This form of beauty is not a face, or a painting, or a sunset. It's the pure beauty that makes all of those things into the beautiful form. Seeing that is the goal of love and philosophy. Plato thus taught that love, eros, can be a motivating force that leads the soul from the bodily to the spiritual, ultimately to the form of beauty and thereby to truth. It's a striking idea. The philosopher is a kind of lover, yearning not for mortal beauty but for eternal beauty, which, I suppose, is the same as yearning for eternal wisdom. But Plato was also his own critic. He recognized that the theory of forms raises tough questions, and tough questions is what philosophy is all about. In his later dialogue, Parmenides, he stage tests his theory through a conversation between a young Socrates and the elder philosopher Parmenides. Parmenides presses Socrates with a sharp question, such as, is there a form for everything? What about mundane or vile things like mud, hair, or dirt? Do those have eternal forms too? The young Socrates hesitates, embarrassed at the idea of lofty forms for such lowly things. Parmenides also points out a logical problem. If a thing partakes of a form, the form must either be whole in each new thing. In fact, how can one thing be wholly in many places at once, or split up among them, in which case the form would be divisible and not truly one? And if we say a form is one and the particulars many, must there not be a further form that encompasses both the particular and the form, leading to an infinite regress, sometimes called the third man argument? Well, Plato doesn't resolve these puzzles outright, at least not in the Parmenides. The dialogue ends with more questions than answers, a prevailing theme, but it shows that Plato was aware of potential contradictions or complexities in his own theory. This critical self-examination is part of Plato's teaching too. Philosophy must be willing to question its own foundations. Despite these difficulties, Plato never abandoned the forms. Aristotle reports that Plato viewed the forms as separate entities, the true realities of which the physical world is a shadow. And in dialogues like Timaeus, a cosmological work, and Philebus, Plato continued to rely on forms as explanatory principles. They are crucial to his explanations of nature, ethics, and knowledge. We can take one example. When explaining the creation of the universe in Timaeus, Plato describes a divine craftsman who looks to the eternal forms as blueprints to shape the cosmos. So the forms remain central all the way through his philosophy, even as he refines the concept. So, to sum it all up, the theory of forms in a practical way, we could say that Plato taught what is truly real and knowable, and not the individual things that we bump into, but the abstract essences that those things instantiate. Our world is like a shadow play. Think about that cave. The forms are the realities casting the shadows. Knowledge thus requires turning away from mere appearances and grasping these forms with the mind. This vision has immense implications for every branch of philosophy. It forms the backbone of Plato's views on the soul, politics, ethics, and art, to which is what we will now turn to. For Plato, a human being is essentially a soul, a psyche using a body. He taught that the soul is not only immortal, but also divine in origin and akin to the forms. In the work Phaedo, as Socrates awaits his execution, the dialogue's whole thrust is to show that a true philosopher should not fear death, because death is the separation of the soul and body, allowing the soul to attain the pure knowledge that it longs for. Socrates presents several arguments for the soul's immortality. One is the argument from recollection, which we had discussed briefly when we were talking about meno, since we seem to recall knowledge from before birth, like the concept of perfect equality. Our souls existed before we were born, you see. Another is the affinity argument, the soul being invisible, intelligible, and immortal, like the forms, naturally survives the death of the visible mortal body. By the end of Phaedo, Socrates is utterly convinced, and Plato wants us to be convinced too, that the soul will continue to exist and think after death, especially the virtuous soul that has detached itself from bodily pleasures and focused on philosophy. Plato's conception of the soul is not just as an immortal monad. He offers a dynamic psychology of the soul's parts. You see, in Republic, Book 4, he famously describes the tripartite soul. By observing internal conflicts, well, let's take, for example, like when you're thirsty but refuse to drink because you know the water is unsafe, Plato deduces that there must be different agents or aspects within us. He identifies three parts of the soul: the rational part, the mind that reasons and seeks truth; the spirited part, which feels anger, indignation; and the appetitive part, which desires food, drink, and other bodily pleasures. Each part has its own object. Reason loves truth and wisdom. Spirit loves honor and victory. Appetite loves sensual gratification. But these parts can conflict. For instance, your appetites might crave a second piece of cake, while your reason advises against it for health's sake. You might then feel a bit of spirited remorse, or perhaps pride, depending on whichever side wins. Plato's vivid illustration includes an anecdote about Leontius, who felt a disgusting yet compulsive desire to look at executed corpses. His reason recoiled in revulsion, but his appetite for the morbid sight pulled him in until he gave in, and then he furiously berated his own eyes. This, Socrates says, shows the spirited part, that anger or shame, siding with reason against the appetite's base craving. In a well-ordered soul, reason should rule. Spirit should enforce reason's judgments like a courageous lieutenant, and appetite should obey. When each part performs its proper role, the individual achieves inner justice, the psychic harmony that is virtue. So, Plato taught that virtue in a person consists in a healthy hierarchy of the soul's parts, with reason in command, guiding the whole soul towards what is truly good. Plato extends this psychology to society as a whole, which we will examine soon. But one more aspect of the soul is its cosmic journey. Plato's mythic imagination comes alive when talking about the fate of the soul. After the end of the Republic, he includes that myth of a grand story of how souls are judged after death, and either rewarded or punished before choosing a new life to be reborn into. The details need not detain us, but the upshot is that Plato saw life as one chapter in a long saga of the soul. The choices we make and the character we develop have repercussions far beyond this life. But similarly, in Phaedrus, Plato presents a beautiful myth of the soul's origin and its yearning for ultimate truth. In fact, he likens it to a charioteer, that being reason, driving two winged horses, one noble being the spirit, and one unruly being appetite. In the heavens before birth, souls followed the gods in a great procession, glimpsing the forms, truth, beauty, justice shining in the divine realm. But most souls stumbled, and they lost their wings, falling to earth and incarnating in human bodies. Ever since, a soul that recalls that vision grows wings once more. That is, it regains its divine potential. What triggers such a recollection most powerfully? Beauty, which is why the sight of beauty, physical or moral, can inspire these wings of love and yearning within us, lifting us toward the divine. Plato taught that the soul can ascend by love and philosophy, back to communion with the eternal forms. This poetic imagery conveys his conviction that the soul is out of its element in the material world and longs to return to that higher state of reality. So let's summarize it like this. Plato's teachings on the soul. The soul is immortal, temporarily embodied, divided in parts, and capable of rising to great heights of virtue and knowledge, if, and only if, it is properly cultivated. It mirrors in microcosm the structure of reality. a rational core akin to the divine realm of forms, which must govern the baser parts tied to the physical world. So education and self-discipline are therefore all about helping the rational soul gain control over the irrational parts and ultimately remember its true home. Now, of course, the rational soul can't really get much control without a good dose of ethics and virtue. And that's where we turn to now. Ethics for Plato is intimately connected with his metaphysics and psychology. If knowledge is one of the eternal forms, then the highest knowledge is knowledge of the good. Effectively, that is, knowledge of what is most valuable, what really makes life worth living, and what makes a good life worth living. Plato identified the form of the good as the ultimate principle, but he also grappled with what it means for human conduct. There is a hallmark of Platonic ethics, the idea that a virtue is a kind of knowledge. Socrates often argued that nobody knowingly does evil. If people act wrongly, it's because they are ignorant of the good. And Plato largely endorses this view. To be virtuous is to know what truly benefits your soul. And if you genuinely know that, then, well, it's very difficult to act against it. This certainly helps Plato explain why to put such emphasis on education and philosophy, because to make people just and virtuous, one must first begin by enlightening their understanding. In dialogues like Protagoras, Socrates, being voiced by Plato, argues that things like courage or self-control are not just innate traits, but rather they rely on understanding of what is truly fearful or what's truly in one's best interest. By the time of the Republic, Plato lays out a full vision of the cardinal virtues. Wisdom, when reason leads. Courage, when spirit upholds the convictions of reason about what to fear and what to not fear. Temperance, when appetites obey reason, creating harmony. And justice, each part doing its proper work, keeping that balance. These virtues in the individual mirror the classes in the ideal city, rulers, guardians, producers, each doing their own job, fulfilling their own purpose. For Plato, individual morality and societal morality share a structure. Both are about a well-ordered hierarchy. Of course, it's all under the guidance of reason. But Plato also tackled a cynical challenge. Why be just at all? In Republic, Book 2, Plato's brothers make the case that justice is only valued for its consequences, good reputation, rewards, and that given the chance to get away with injustice undetected, most people would do so. This is illustrated with the legend of Giges' ring, a ring that makes one invisible. Now, Glaucon asserts that even a just man, if invisible, would eventually act unjustly, since there's just no way he could be caught. Plato, through Socrates, spends the rest of Republic arguing against this, trying to show that justice is intrinsically better for the soul than injustice, even apart from external rewards. Now his answer, in short, is that the soul in which reason rules, and each part performs its function, is harmonious and healthy, that being just, whereas an unjust soul is internally at war. Imagine the despotism of base appetites seizing control, causing chaos in one's inner life. Injustice might bring external gains, but it wrecks the soul. It makes one a slave to endless fears and desires. Plato taught that justice is the health of the soul. and thus it is desirable simply for its own sake, regardless of any external circumstance. But you might ask, and it's a fair question, if virtue is knowledge, why do people who seem to know the good still fail to do it? Well, guess what? Plato had an answer for that too. His answer would be that perhaps they don't truly understand it. They may have an intellectual grasp, but the appetitive part has not been fully subordinated. The knowledge hasn't permeated the whole soul. In later dialogues, Plato allows that mortal education involves not just dialectic, but habituation and training of the non-rational parts of the soul, etc., music and gymnastics in the Republic curriculum, to shape the spirited and appetitive aspects. But still, he maintains that no one really errs willfully in the ultimate sense. As Socrates says in the Protagoras, quote, "No one goes willingly toward the bad." When people choose what is bad, it is under the appearance of good. We think of things like the short-term pleasure mistaken for a true good, to ignorance or a distorted perspective. Another component of Plato's ethics is his belief in an objective moral order. Just as the forms like justice, goodness, they're all real, virtue is not relative. Plato was dismayed by the sophists of the time, you see, who taught that right and wrong were mere conventions, or that might makes right. Against this, Plato posited a transcendent good. Even if human opinions vary, the good itself does not change. Philosophers, by training their minds, can glimpse the form of the good, and thus become true experts in ethics. This elitist element, that only a few may truly know the good, fed directly into his political theory. And political theory is where we get to now. So Plato's most famous political teaching is often summarized in his statement that, quote, "There will be no end to the troubles of states till philosophers become kings in this world, or till those we now call kings and rulers really and truly become philosophers." In the Republic, Plato designs an ideal city, that being Callipolis, as a microcosm to reflect justice writ large. Each class in the city corresponds to a part of the soul. The guardians, ruling philosophers, correspond to reason. The auxiliaries, warriors enforcing the ruler's will, correspond to spirit. And the producers, farmers, artisans, merchants, who provide for material needs, well, they correspond to appetite. Yes. Justice in the city is achieved when each class performs its own function well and does not meddle in the other's roles under the wise leadership of the guardians. But what is radical in Plato's teaching is the idea of a philosopher king. He argues that people fit to rule are those who love truth above all, are educated in understanding the forms, and have gone through rigorous intellectual and moral training, outlined across the books of the Republic, that is 6 to 7. These philosophers, having seen the form of the good, do not lust for power or wealth. Indeed, they must be cajoled to rule as a kind of duty, because they recognize that the alternative is governance by the ignorant. The rationale is pretty straightforward. If you want a good society, those in charge, well, they have to know what good is. Just as you would want a trained pilot to steer a ship and not the uninformed passengers, Plato wants trained philosophers to steer the ship of state, not the masses who are swayed by unexamined opinions and selfish appetites. Plato's critique of existing systems, especially Athenian democracy, is pretty severe. He saw democracy as rule by the ignorant many, prone to disorder, and susceptible to demagogues. In Republic, Book 8, he describes a cycle of corrupt constitutions, democracy, that is, rule by the honor-loving warriors, degrading into oligarchy, rule by the rich, which then falls into democracy, rule by the masses, and freedom run amok, which in turn leads to tyranny, one person seizing absolute power. Democracy for Plato was dangerously unstable. Too much license, not enough discipline or wisdom, and it killed Socrates, whom Plato regarded as the most just man in Athens. So how could a system that did that be one worth preserving? So Plato taught that unchecked freedom and equality in democracy can lead to chaos, which in turn breeds tyranny. There was a solution: to nip that in the bud by instituting a government led by wise and virtuous guardians. To prevent rulers from abusing power, Plato made the provocative suggestion that the guardians class live in communal simplicity. No private property, no private families for the ruling class. Guardians, men and women, both in Plato's city, would live together, share meals, and even have spouses and children in common, with mating regulated for eugenic purposes, though done under the guise of random lotteries. The idea was to make sure that the rulers had no loyalty except to the common good. They wouldn't favor their own children or amass wealth for themselves, because their needs were met, and luxuries, well, they were forbidden. This is perhaps the most startling point of Plato's Republic for the modern reader. Indeed, it startled people in antiquity too. But it does flow from his principle: the guardian's virtue must not be corrupted by self-interest. And Plato also curtailed the arts in his ideal state. It's another notable teaching: censorship of poetry and music for moral and educational ends. In Republic, books 2 to 3, and again in book 10, Plato argues that much of Greek poetry, that is, Homer, Hesiod, tragic dramas, portrays the gods and heroes in immoral lights, or just stirs up excessive emotions. He feared that stories of gods behaving badly would erode the youth's sense of virtue, or that dramatic poetry could inflame passions and destabilize reason's control. Therefore, he would allow only hymns to the gods and edifying tales of virtuous heroes, art that uplifts the soul toward the good. Famously, he even says that poets would be kindly shown out of the just city, for their own works' seductive falsehoods are simply not welcome. This stance shows an important tension in Plato's thought. Earlier in the dialogue Ion, Plato, through Socrates, describes poets as divinely inspired, possessed by the muses, essentially saying their art isn't based on knowledge, but on inspiration akin to madness. By the Republic, Plato explicitly distrusts artistic inspiration that isn't governed by reason and truth. He taught that art itself must be subordinate to moral truth, otherwise it's a dangerous illusion. Yet Plato himself was a master literary artist. One of those intriguing ironies of philosophy, I suppose. Yet one might wonder, did Plato ever try to put these political ideas into practice? Well, he did, and it became a famous cautionary tale. Plato made multiple trips to Syracuse in Sicily, where a young tyrant named Dionysius II ruled. Plato's friend Dion helped make Dionysius into a philosopher king of sorts. According to later reports, including Plato's own seventh letter and the account of Diogenes Laertius, Plato attempted to educate Dionysius and guide reforms. The efforts failed, quite spectacularly. Dionysius grew suspicious of Plato, perhaps resisting the discipline of philosophy. In one incident with Dionysius's father, the earlier tyrant Dionysius I, Plato's frank criticisms of tyranny so offended the ruler that the tyrant allegedly shouted that Plato talks like a fool, and Plato came back with, "You act like a tyrant." Ooh, that ought to show him. Well, the story goes that Dionysius I, in a rage, arranged to have Plato sold into slavery. Plato was taken to the island of Aegina and put up for sale as a war captive. But, in a pretty remarkable stroke of luck, a passing friend, a philosopher named Anicarus, recognized Plato and ransomed him, purchasing his freedom for 20 or 30 minas. Anicarus then sent Plato home to Athens safely. This near-death experience shows how dangerous it was to preach philosophy to power. It's a lesser-known anecdote, sure, but it's one worth mentioning, that Plato was doing some pretty high-stakes teachings, and for them he almost paid with his life for telling a tyrant that virtue matters more than his self-interest. But Plato tried again with Dionysius II later, but he met with intrigues and was even held against his will for a time until another friend, the mathematician Archytas, helped him escape. Now these adventures likely tempered Plato's hopes of ever seeing a real philosopher king. Nevertheless, they did not temper his belief that philosophy is the only path to just governance, and that converting actual tyrants was perhaps a lost cause. In his final work, Laws, Plato outlines a second-best city, notably without philosopher kings, since he might have resigned that to the impracticality of the ideal. In the Laws, he still aims for a highly ordered society with rigorous laws governing education, religion, and even drinking parties. The Laws is starkly less utopian and a lot more pragmatic. It allows private property and families, but regulates them strictly. Plato's tone there is less hopeful about human nature. If you can't have wisdom rule directly, then the law must be king. A pretty rigid framework to keep people on the straight path. The absence of Socrates in this dialogue, and the more pedestrian approach to virtue, shows Plato in a more realist light. Yet the goal remains the same, to make people virtuous, and their souls harmonious through the structure of the city. But while discussing politics, we touched a little bit on Plato's view of art, but it certainly deserves a little bit more attention. Reveals a bit of a nuance in what Plato was teaching. In fact, his relationships with art and poetry is quite famously ambivalent. On one hand, his dialogues are full of myths, allegories, and literary brilliance. Plato is an artist of language, that's for sure. But on the other hand, he often warns that art can mislead. The tension here is between using imaginative stories as educational tools versus indulging in a fantasy that obscures the truth. That is where the line is drawn. He recognized that not everyone will grasp abstract philosophy. Therefore, he frequently uses myth to communicate with our non-rational side. The myth of the cave, the chariot allegory of the soul, the myth of about the afterlife, judgment, they're all didactic myths. Plato is teaching via storytelling. knowing that a vivid image can stir the soul to seek understanding. In this sense, Plato taught through myth to complement reason, engaging the whole person. He once likened the effect of a good myth or noble lie to a medicine for the soul, useful to inspire virtue or courage when plain argument might not suffice. However, he also believed that most poets and tragedians were themselves clueless about the higher truths. In his dialogue, Ion, Socrates humorously flatters a rhapsody, a professional reciter of Homer, by saying that his artistic inspiration is like a magnetic, divine frenzy. The muse inspires the poet inspires the performer, and the performer inspires the audience, all in a chain of irrational enchantment. It's a double-edged compliment. Sure, it's divine inspiration, but the former does not speak from knowledge. In fact, Socrates concludes that Ion and his ilk don't really know anything. They just have a gift for stirring emotions. Thus, Plato implies that art without truth is at best entertainment, and at worst, a kind of lie. All of this culminates in Republic Book 10, where Plato bans most mimetic poetry, that is, poetry that imitates real life through narrative and character. He argues that a poet like Homer might imitate a virtuous hero without actually understanding virtue. The poem is an imitation of an imitation, since physical life is already an imitation of the forms, which makes poetry thrice removed from the truth. Moreover, poetry often conflicts with reason by portraying the gods as immoral or glorifying excessive grief and passion. Plato's strictures here teach us that he valued truth and moral clarity over emotional impact. If an art form could be reformed to portray what is good or true, surely Plato would welcome it. But if it couldn't, well, it's just a distraction from the more important things. This is why he only allowed certain kinds of music and modes and rhythms in his ideal city, those that would foster courage or moderation. The rest just got censored. But we should note, Plato does not completely reject art. He wanted to harness it for education. One might say that Plato was teaching future thinkers to approach art critically. Appreciate its beauty, yes, but always ask, does it lead us towards truth or away from it? This critical lens remains pretty influential. Plato essentially started the conversation about art's moral and epistemological effect, a conversation continuing in aesthetics and literature classes to this very day. Finally, there is Plato's intriguing critique of writing itself, found in the Phaedrus. Through a myth about the Egyptian god Thoth offering the invention of writing to King Tharmus, Plato voices a worry. Writing might actually weaken memory and genuine understanding. Tharmus, in the myth, says, "This invention will produce forgetfulness in the souls of learners, because they will not use their memory. They will trust to external written characters, and not remembering of themselves. You give your disciples not truth, but only the semblance of truth." In a playful irony, Plato writes this warning about writing in a written dialogue. Ironic indeed. But the point is subtle. Text can't answer back or tailor itself to the reader's needs. True teaching is interactive, just like dialectic. So Plato taught that while writing preserves knowledge, it's inferior to live dialogue to achieve real understanding. This perhaps explains why Plato wrote in a way that forces the reader to engage actively. The dialogue form, with its questions and lack of explicit conclusions, certainly encourages us to think along. Plato's own unwritten teachings were rumored among later followers. Aristotle hints that Plato had esoteric doctrines about the one and the indefinite dyad, a kind of primordial duality, which he supposedly only shared in lectures at the academy and not in books. Whether or not that's true, it certainly does fit the pattern. Plato might have reserved his most abstract or technical insights for oral discussion, not the written page. To his mind, philosophy was a living practice, certainly not a static text. Well, it's past the 1 hour point now. We've certainly surveyed many aspects of what Plato taught. Pursuit of wisdom and virtue, reality of forms and the good, ideal of philosopher kings, the dialectical method. But it is worth pausing to consider how these ideas fit together. And furthermore to that, how exactly did they evolve across Plato's lifetime of teaching? There is a striking feature that is the unity of Plato's vision. Everything connects. Why be just? Because it harmonizes the soul, aligning it with the form of justice. And how do we know what justice is? Through reason and recollecting the forms, illuminated by the good. Who should rule society? Those who know what justice and good are. What education do they need? One that turns the soul from the world of becoming shadows to the world of being forms. What lifestyle supports that? Communal, disciplined living with an emphasis on philosophy, not wealth or fame. Why avoid indulgent art or rhetoric? Because they drag back the soul into the cave of illusion and passion. But underpinning all this, why trust reason? Because the soul is akin to the divine and can grasp eternal truth, whereas unbridled appetite or social convention cannot. Plato's teachings form a coherent philosophical system, one of the first of its kind. Psychology, ethics, metaphysics, epistemology, and politics, all woven into a single tapestry, centered on the vision of the good. However, Plato's thought was not stagnant. Scholars often divide his works into early, middle, and late period, but nothing really shifts. In early works, sometimes called Socratic dialogues, Plato focuses on ethical questions and leaves them open. For example, Euthyphro asks, "What is piety?" But it ends inconclusively. Laches asks, "What is courage?" And it doesn't really find a final answer. One could say that at that stage Plato mainly taught the importance of recognizing our ignorance, and that is a lesson that is very Socratic in its nature. But in the middle period, we're talking works like Phaedo, Republic, Symposium, Meno, Plato introduces his grand theories like recollection, forms, tripartite soul, etc. Here, he's more willing to assert positive doctrines, using Socrates as a spokesperson for Plato's own insights. It's as if Plato gained confidence that he had glimpsed some profound truth and was eager to share them, albeit through dialogical exploration. And then we have the later dialogues, Laws, Philebus, Parmenides, Sophist, etc. He becomes a lot more critical and technical, re-examining the theory of knowledge. He visits the forms critically in Parmenides, as we saw. He refines his ontology in the Sophist, distinguishing different kinds of being and even wrestling with the concept of non-being to address how false statements are possible. Philebus takes on the question of the good life, balancing pleasure and intellect. And laws, well, that revises the pure idealism of republic for a more workable second-best state, governed by strict laws and a nocturnal council of quasi-philosophers to keep doctrine on track. Across these developments, we see Plato's critical spirit and his willingness to adapt. He did not dogmatically insist on the first formulation of his ideas. For instance, the later dialogues suggest he recognized not all knowledge as simply recollection of prenatally acquired truths. Doesn't need to account for empirical learning and language. But he also hedged the absolute separation of forms and material things with a more nuanced view of participation. None of this is a refutation of his core principles, don't get me wrong, but it does show a mind that is always turning concepts over, strengthening them by examining objections. Plato also occasionally acknowledges mystery. The form of the good, for example, is never directly defined in the Republic. Socrates even says it is, quote, beyond being, exceeding it in dignity and power, something grasped only with a great bit of difficulty. And in his seventh letter, Plato, if it is truly his words, warns that no writing of his will ever contain his deepest teaching, because knowledge of the highest things comes from a sudden flash of insight, born in the soul after a long period of gestation, through dialectic and not from written words. Thus, Plato taught not only specific doctrines, but also a method of seeking and a respect for the complexity of truth, inviting us to follow and partake in the inquiry ourselves. But to conclude, what Plato actually taught is a rich and complex philosophy, grounded in a pursuit of objective truth and goodness. He taught that reality is ultimately intellectual and moral, and not merely something material. He taught that we have within us the capacity to know eternal truth, if we cultivate our reason and tame our passions, that is. He taught that justice and virtue are fundamentally about harmony, within our soul and within society. He also taught that good leadership is wise and selfless, and that without wisdom, power is corrupt. He taught that education is not stuffing the mind with information, but more about turning the soul toward the good. He taught us to use stories and images to elevate, not to delude. He even, by example, taught humility, the lifelong willingness to have one's ideas tested and to keep learning. So Plato's questions really become our own questions. What is justice? What can we truly know? How should we live? And in pursuing these, we, in effect, across time, become just another one of his students. And perhaps that is the most compelling answer to what Plato taught. He taught us to philosophize. In the end, the specifics of his answers matter deeply, but even more important is the drive to seek truth and virtue that he exemplifies. As Diotima replied in the Symposium, the ultimate vision of beauty or goodness makes a life truly worth living. Plato devoted his life to reaching for that vision and helping others get to it too. And in doing so, he became one of the greatest teachers in history. His teachings, academic yet engaging, analytical yet inspired, remain a cornerstone of intellectual life. So to study Plato is to engage with a mind that can illuminate our own souls, and he wouldn't have it any other way. The late 4th century BC, in an Athenian grove under the shaded colonnades of the Lyceum, a group of students follows a man as he strolls along and speaks. This is Aristotle, a brilliant polymath, whose very name in Greek means excellent or the best. But far from the dry character that one might picture of an old philosopher, Aristotle had plenty of his own personal quirks. According to one ancient biographer, he spoke with a slight lisp, and was quite conspicuous in his dress, even known for wearing fashionable rings. Yet when he opened his mouth to teach, that was where the real magic happened. Ideas changing the way that people thought about the world. In fact, in his lifetime, Aristotle even tutored a young Alexander the Great, and then returned to Athens to found his own school. He would lecture while walking about, earning his followers the nickname walkers or peripatetics. His teaching covered seemingly everything: logic, politics, ethics, physics, biology, art, essentially the sum of all knowledge available at the time. But how can we boil all this down into simple terms? What did he actually teach, in his own words and ideas? Well, Aristotle's surviving texts are mostly lecture notes and treatises, not polished essays for the public. They can be dense and detailed, but they do reveal a mind trying to systematically understand the world around it. Throughout these works, one can hear Aristotle's voice encouraging observation, critical reasoning, and the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. In fact, he begins his metaphysics with the simple declaration that all men, by nature, desire to know. Curiosity, in other words, is simply built into us. So today, we're going to explore Aristotle's actual teachings. We're going to try to not weigh it down with the fanciful words and all the jargon. We're going to build it up from a foundation. And by the end, from everything from logic, science, ethics, and art, I think we can understand together what Aristotle actually taught. Our goal is to walk alongside Aristotle himself in the Lyceum garden and see the world as his students might have. So bring with you your wonder, your critical questions, and most importantly, your sense of discovery. First, let me welcome you to the channel. It's going to be a bit of a longer one. If you've come here to fall asleep, well, you're probably going to. But if you've come here to learn about the philosophy, well, that's great. We're going to learn quite a lot about it today. I would like to thank the patrons for kindly supporting the channel, and I would like to thank those who checked out the merch store. Anybody who's new to the channel, drop a like and subscribe. And comments and all the rest always help the algorithm. Let's try to fill this platform with things like history and philosophy. Make a better world for everyone, don't you think? Now, enough of that. Let's get down to the topic at hand. Nice and relaxed. Slow, as always. Of course, it's a pretty good idea when we understand Aristotle's teachings, or at least attempt to do so, to try to understand the context in which he taught. Well, let's begin. Aristotle was born in 384, that is 384 BCE in Stagira, or BC for those inclined. Now, Stagira was a town in northern Greece. He came from a family of a medicinal background. His father was actually a court physician to the king of Macedon. This early exposure to biology and the natural world was perhaps what planted the seeds in Aristotle's later fascination with living things. Unfortunately, we don't have a great deal of information that's beyond the realm of conjecture about this time, but we do know that as a teenager, Aristotle went to Athens to study under Plato at the academy. I'm sure you've heard of him. Plato was actually his mentor for about 20 years, and from Plato, Aristotle inherited a love of philosophy. But of course, he eventually developed his own approach. Plato had taught that beyond the mess of the physical world, there are perfect abstract forms. Let's think about things like a perfect justice, a perfect beauty, a perfect circle, etc., and that these eternal forms are more real than the changing world than we perceive. Aristotle, who was always the empiricist, managed to take a different view. You see, Aristotle believed the real world as we experience it is worth of study in its own right, and that forms or universals exist within things, not apart from them. One later report on Aristotle notes that in the work On the Soul, he outright says, quote, "Universal forms do not exist separately. Only particular things exist, and our abstract ideas come from them." While Aristotle, of course, respected Plato, in fact, he famously referred to Plato as a friend, but truth as a dearer friend, he was willing to depart from his teacher's theories in order to follow the own evidence that he had personally found. Of course, the entire method of Aristotle starts with observation, without any judgment, just pure observation. There is an ancient summary of his work that remarks as follows: "It is characteristic of Aristotle's philosophy not to ignore the visible phenomena." In practice, this means Aristotle collected information about the world tirelessly. When he later founded his school, the Lyceum in Athens, he and his students amassed a sort of early research library. Maps, specimens, descriptions of the constitutions of 158 different cities, among other treasures. And do remember that Greece was an amalgamation of city-states at this time. Now there was even a tradition that Aristotle's most famous royal pupil, Alexander the Great, sent him exotic animals and plants from Asia so that Aristotle could study them. By all accounts, Aristotle took a keen empirical approach. Investigate, compare, and only then theorize. Despite this down-to-earth emphasis, Aristotle was not an anti-theory mind. In fact, he sought universal principles by which to organize the knowledge gained from observation. His approach was both inductive, that is, building general ideas from particular examples, and deductive, that is, deriving conclusions from first principles. He pioneered formal logic to aid in this process. Aristotle is often called the father of logic, because he systematically defined the rules of correct reasoning. Even antiquity remembered this. An ancient biographical note credits Aristotle with the discovery of logic, distinguishing the patterns of syllogistic reasoning and something new in philosophy. For example, Aristotle taught how to form a valid syllogism, a logical argument with two premises and a conclusion. If we are going to make an example, say, all humans are mortal, Socrates is a human, therefore Socrates is mortal. Things like this. Now this logical toolkit, in its most basic sense, compiled in works known as the Organon, was Aristotle's way of ensuring clear thinking. He believed that knowledge had structure, and that by understanding logic, one could discern truths about the world in a more organized fashion. He also emphasized that knowledge must have sound foundations. In his Posterior Analytics, he explains that to truly know something, we must know its cause and understand why that thing must be so. He wrote, "We do not have knowledge of a thing until we have grasped its why. that is to say, its cause. This reflects Aristotle's conviction that everything in nature has an explanation. It's the philosopher's job to find it. Of course, when we use this term nature, it is a broad, encompassing term, and do not think of nature just as the plants and trees, the rivers, the skies, things like this. We're thinking about man's nature, the nature of morality, this kind of thing. This is what we're using this blanket term for. So while he urged this observation first, he always pushed further to ask simply why the thing is the way it is, and this habit of asking why led Aristotle to formulate a framework of causes that pervade his science and metaphysics. So let's start by explaining the four causes and scientific explanation. You see, one of his key teachings in his theory were these four causes, the four ways of explaining why a thing is. This was his answer to the question why in a comprehensive sense. If you had asked him why a statue exists, for example, he would say there are four different but complementary answers. The first being the material cause, that is, what a thing is made of. In the example of the statue, the material cause is the marble or bronze from which the statue has been carved from. This explains the substance underlying the object. And then we have the formal cause, that is, what shape or form a thing takes. It is the design, pattern, or the essence of the thing. For the statue, the formal cause is the shape of the sculpture, say the form of a human figure that the sculptor had envisioned. In living things, the formal cause is like the blueprint of a creature, which makes a cat, a dog, for instance, is its particular form or essence. Then we have the efficient cause, what made it, i.e. the source of the change or the agent. In our example, the efficient cause is the sculptor chiseling the statue, the immediate force or action that brings the statue into being. Aristotle often describes this as the mover or initiator of a process. For a child, the efficient cause is the parent. For a ball rolling, the efficient cause is the person who pushed the ball. And then we have the final cause. Why does it exist? In terms of its end or purpose. This is the goal or function of a thing. What is it for? We can say the rain is for watering the gardens. The air exists for its breathing. The light exists for our seeing. Things like this. For the statue example, the final cause might be to beautify a temple or to honor a god, its intended purpose. In nature, the final cause is akin to the organism's purpose, or the reason something is done. For example, the eye would exist for the sake of seeing. Vision is the eye's final cause. So these four causes, material, formal, efficient, and final, are the central things to what Aristotle taught in both science and philosophy. Unlike modern usage, Aristotle's idea of cause is quite broad. It's an explanation, not just a cause and effect in a narrow sense. So when Aristotle explained natural phenomena, he often identified all four aspects. Take a living organism. Materially, it's made of flesh and bone. Formally, it's come from a certain structure, that is a dog's anatomy and dog essence. Efficiently, it came from parent dogs, and finally, it lives in order to thrive and reproduce, that being its biological purpose. Now, using this four-cause lens, Aristotle systematically analyzed everything from physics to biology. It's important to note that Aristotle saw a special importance in final causes or purposes, especially in the realm of biology. In his view, saying that birds have wings isn't enough. One should probably add birds have wings in order to fly, that causal effect of having wings. This teleological or purpose-driven way of thinking is one way Aristotle differed from some earlier thinkers who might describe only the material or mechanical aspect of things. Aristotle argued that nature, like human art, does nothing randomly. Everything tends towards some end or fulfills some function. As he put it, nature does nothing without purpose. While modern science sometimes shies away from speaking about purpose in nature, Aristotle found it a useful explanatory concept. He taught that understanding a thing's function or goal is essential to truly knowing it. Hand in hand with this idea of causes, Aristotle also taught his students a framework for the organization of knowledge itself. He delineated different fields of study and insisted on approaching each one appropriately. For instance, in works on logic and epistemology, such as the work Posterior Analytics, he describes how we come to know things in certain stages. You see, according to him, our knowledge starts from sensory perception. We see the world, we hear the world, we touch the world. From repeated perceptions, we form memories, and from accumulated memories, we develop experience. It is then, with intellect, we abstract general principles and truths. Aristotle illustrated this in the metaphysics. Animals have sensation, some animals remember, but humans can also convert memory into experience, and from experience draw universal knowledge, or even art. He saw human beings as uniquely capable of moving from the particular to the general. For example, noticing that a certain herbal remedy helped several sick people, that is the particulars, and then concluding a general medicinal rule. Aristotle explains, art arises when from many instances of experience, one universal judgment about a class of objects is produced. In other words, we grasp a principle, like a medical treatment that works for all patients of a type, only after seeing enough cases. This was a lesson in method. Aristotle taught that knowledge is built step by step, grounded in observation, but aiming at general truths. Aristotle's logical works, that being on interpretation, posterior analytics, prior analytics, categories, probably topics as well, yeah. A few more minor works. Well, they were essentially textbooks for clear thinking. He classified propositions, studied how arguments fail or succeed, and set out rules for valid inference. One key contribution was his theory of the syllogism, the structured deductive argument. For example, all mammals are warm-blooded, all whales are mammal, therefore all whales are warm-blooded. Aristotle showed why such arguments are reliable, and how a series of syllogisms could build up a chain of reasoning. This formal approach to logic was unprecedented. The early biographer, Ptolemy, notes admiringly that Aristotle, quote, distinguished the methods of syllogism, and thereby essentially invented the field of logic. And well, for a philosopher, having the title of being the one who effectively invented the field of logic, well, that's quite a title to hold, isn't it? But Aristotle also recognized that logic itself had its limits. He taught that different subjects require different levels of precision. In ethics or politics, for instance, one cannot expect the same certainty as in mathematics. This is because human affairs are variable. Aristotle cautioned students that we must demand only as much precision as the subject allows. A very practical piece of pedagogical advice, certainly. He was basically warning against oversimplification. One shouldn't treat ethical reasoning like a geometry proof, nor should one apply moral sentiments to empirical science. Think about it this way. Each domain of knowledge has to have its own appropriate method. What's going to work in mathematics is not going to work in morality. And there was another aspect of Aristotle's teaching on knowledge. It was his classification of the sciences. He divided knowledge into theoretical science like physics, metaphysics, and mathematics aimed at truth for its own sake, practical sciences such as ethics, politics aimed at good action, and productive knowledge, that is, crafts and arts, all aimed at creating things. This is a triad of knowledge, this triad of doing and making. Those three methods cover the spectrum of human intellectual activity. Humans know, they do, and they make. Therefore, could you ask yourself, if a human does not know, does not do, and does not make, according to Aristotelian questioning, is it really a human? Well, either way, by categorizing knowledge in this way, Aristotle gave students a map of learning. But you shouldn't confuse, say, the study of nature with the exercise of political decision-making, even if both involve the same deductive reasoning, because each one of those fields has its own logic, its own aims, and its first principles. Well, all that being said and explained the best way we can, let's move on to nature and metaphysics, substance and change. When Aristotle turned to nature, that is physis, basically what we call science, he taught in great detail about physics, cosmology, and biology. A recurring theme in his teaching is the analysis of change and substance. Unlike his teacher Plato, who was fascinated by unchanging ideals, Aristotle was fascinated by how things transform, and yet retain an identity of their own. For Aristotle, the fundamental reality is the individual substance, an individual thing like, well, let's say a particular tree, a particular cat, a particular human, perhaps. Each substance is a combination of matter and form. Now this is called hylomorphism, from hyla or hyla, meaning matter, and morphe, meaning form. Aristotle taught that we should think of any object in terms of what it is made of, its matter, and what shape or essence it has, its form. For example, a clay statue is clay matter organized in the form of a figure. The matter by itself isn't the full reality. That being said, a lump of clay, that is not a statue. And the form by itself isn't a full reality either. The shape must be embodied in some matter. Reality, for Aristotle, is always formed matter, the two aspects intertwined. Now this matter-form framework allowed Aristotle to explain change. When something changes, say wood burns to ash, or a child grows into an adult, Aristotle would describe it as the matter taking on or losing a form. To him, change never meant total annihilation or creation from nothing, rather something persistent. Matter, or underlying substratum, takes on a new form. In his work Physics, Aristotle identifies different types of change. Changes in quality, quantity, place, and substance. A substantial change is when something truly new comes. For example, a seed turning into a plant. Through all changes, however, some aspect remains continuous. The matter, or potential that can become something else, and some aspect is new, the form, an actual state achieved. Think about water becoming ice, things like this. Or perhaps vapor, the same thing just in a different form. Now this sounds pretty abstract, I know, but Aristotle used it to make sense of everything from natural growth to elemental transformations. It was his special way of saying, even when things appear and disappear, there is an intelligible process, some constant element, and some evolving element, rather than just pure chaos. Because we can't have that, can't we? In teaching about nature, Aristotle famously added a fifth element to the traditional four elements of Greek thought, that being earth, water, air, and fire. Observing the heavens, he concluded that celestial bodies, that being the moon, sun, and stars, must be made of a different, unchanging substance, since they move in perfect circles and don't really seem to decay. He called this fifth element ether, or quintessence. So, for Aristotle, the sublunary world below the moon, this is made of mixtures of earth, water, air, and fire constantly changing and interacting with one another. The supralunary world, that is beyond the moon, is made of ether and is eternal and unchanging, stars and planets embedded in crystalline spheres. This cosmology might sound a bit odd today, but it was just his attempt to explain the differing behavior of earthly versus heavenly bodies, and for the time it was very, very advanced. It was a teaching that endured for centuries, though. Medieval scholars, for instance, adopted the Aristotelian cosmos of Earth at the center, encircled by the moon, planets, and fixed stars in their ethereal spheres. At the pinnacle of Aristotle's natural philosophy, it comes from his concept of the unmoved mover. In pondering what ultimately causes the eternal motion of the heavens, Aristotle posited that there must be a prime cause that itself is unmoved, a timeless, immaterial source of all motion. In the 8th book of physics and the 7th book of metaphysics, he describes this unmoved mover as a pure actuality that moves other things not by physical pushing, but the way a beloved object of desire moves a lover as a final cause by attraction. This idea doubled as Aristotle's notion of the divine, the perfect, eternal intellect, contemplating only the highest thing, which is itself, while abstract Aristotle's unmoved mover teaching aimed to answer the basic question his students surely were wondering about, and that is, what is the first cause of everything? A pretty old question. People are still asking that one these days, aren't they? Well, Aristotle's answer was not a creation story, but it was a philosophical principle, an ultimate rational explanation for the motion and order we see in the cosmos. Crucially, Aristotle taught that even when searching for the ultimate causes, one must not leap to superstition or abandon observational facts. He balanced his metaphysical discussions with constant reference to evidence. One account of his philosophy emphasizes that Aristotle would give, quote, as evidence what the majority perceive when presenting his proofs. Now this means that he didn't hand-wave away common experience. He started from it, built his foundation from upon it. Let's give an example. When discussing why the Earth is spherical, he noted observable facts, like the shadow on the moon during eclipses. When exploring biology, he grounded his claims in the animals and plants his students could see or dissect. Aristotle's metaphysics and physics were thus taught not as mystical doctrines, but as reasoned conclusions from the ground up. He encouraged students to trust their senses, but also to sift those sensations with intellect to reach the underlying truths. But if there is one area where Aristotle's empirical zeal really shines, it has to be biology. By all accounts, Aristotle was the first thinker to systematically study and classify animals. He had an almost, I suppose you'd call it, a childlike curiosity about living creatures, everything from bees and cuttlefish all the way up to elephants. At his school, the Lyceum, Aristotle reportedly examined over 500 species of animals, observing their anatomy and behavior, and he wrote extensive works about it too, such as The History of Animals, Parts of Animals, Generation of Animals, documenting everything that he could, how certain fish bear live young, how bees make honeycomb, and how the embryo of a chick develops inside an egg. That's how fish bear live young, by the way. Excuse me for misspeaking. Now, some of his observations were amazingly accurate. For instance, his descriptions of the arm-hooked mating of octopuses or the brood care of certain birds, but other claims were mistaken by modern standards. Let's give him a break. He was doing the best with what he could. But it is important, Aristotle was teaching by example that understanding life required patient observation and comparative analysis. And so he often sought patterns. Why do both birds and bats have wing-like structures? What function does each organ serve in different animals? He even dissected animals like marine creatures and perhaps some large mammals to learn internal structures, and all of this was radically new at the time. Nobody before him that we know of approached biology with such thoroughness. One concept Aristotle is known for in biology, and psychology by the way, is his idea of the soul, the psyche, which he defines as the form of a living body. Essentially, the life principle that makes an organism what it is. Unlike Plato, Aristotle did not teach the soul as a ghostly entity trapped in the body or something that migrates from one physical vehicle to the other. Instead, he saw soul and body as two aspects of one thing, like the shape of a wax seal and the wax itself. In his treatise On the Soul, also called De Anima, Aristotle explains that the soul is to the body as form is to matter. It's what organizes a living body, giving it life and abilities. He identified different levels of soul corresponding to different life forms. Plants have a nutritive soul that they can grow and metabolize. Animals have, in addition, a sensitive soul. They can perceive and move. And humans have, on top of those, a rational soul, the ability to think and reason. This hierarchy of life became a staple of Aristotelian teaching. It also fit with his teleological view. Each creature's soul equips it for a purpose. The bird's soul gives it instincts to build nests and the power of flight, and the human soul gives the capacity for language, thought, and society. And so Aristotle taught that studying the soul was part of studying nature. So even his psychology was empirical. For instance, he investigated the senses and asked how we see or hear. He theorized correctly that the eye has something like a lens, and that perception involves a medium like light or air transmitting form to the sense organ. In an era with no microscopes, his inferences were impressively reasoned. He also ventured explorations for memory, sleep, and dreams, treating them as a biological phenomena. The overall message to his students was that life's processes, from breathing or thinking, all have natural explanations. One did not need to invoke myth or pure divine magic to explain the workings of organisms. one could simply seek the mechanism or function behind them. There is a rather, I suppose we can call it a charming example of Aristotle's biological insight, and that's his discussion of maritime biology, or marine rather biology, on the island of Lesbos. It said that during a stay there, he and his colleague Theophrastus studied the lagoon's creatures. Aristotle described the hectocotyle arm of the octopus used in reproduction, and noted how cuttlefish have an internal bone-like structure, i.e. the cuttle bone. These fine details show up in his writings. Students learning from Aristotle would not just hear grand theories, but also concrete facts about the natural world, making the lessons vivid and grounded. It's pretty easy to imagine a lecture where Aristotle, holding a specimen or referring to a drawing, explains how a fish's gills allow it to breathe underwater, or why exactly a heart is located centrally in the body. He was teaching the importance of looking at things closely. In fact, he chided earlier philosophers for making sweeping statements about nature without doing the homework of observation, calling their approach akin to random punches thrown by untrained boxers. I'm sure that that critique was received well by the other philosophers at the time. In any case, Aristotle aimed to train the intellect with both empiricism, that is experience-based knowledge, and rational analysis. Now, of course, the realm of philosophy is not just about the natural sciences. We have to talk about ethics as well. Virtue. What is a good life? Well, Aristotle had his own ideas about this too. You certainly can't go past it. His work, Nicomachean Ethics, a work named either after his son Nicomachus or his father of the same name, by the way, Aristotle asked the big question, and that's, what is the good life for a human being? He taught that every art, inquiry, and action seeks some good, and there must be an ultimate good that we seek for its own sake. He identifies his highest good as eudaimonia, a Greek word often translated as happiness or flourishing. It's kind of like a slow burn sort of happiness, you know? So Aristotle meant something a little bit deeper than this momentary happiness. You see, eudaimonia is living well, the fulfillment of a human life. It's not a fleeting mood, but a lasting state of being fully alive and fulfilled, a deep sense of happiness. Importantly, Aristotle argued that eudaimonia is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. It's something we can achieve by living virtuously over a lifetime and not some gift that fortune simply drops in our lap at random. Central to his ethics is the concept of virtue arete, which for him means excellence of character. He taught that virtues are habits, or dispositions to act in the right way, cultivated by practice and guided by reason. Famously, Aristotle defined moral virtue as a mean between extremes. In his words, quote, "Virtue, then, is a settled disposition of the mind, consisting essentially in the observance of the mean relative to us, this being determined by principle, as the prudent man would determine it." Now, this doctrine of the mean does not mean a bland average of behavior, but finding the right balance in context. For example, courage is the virtue between the extremes of rashness, excess, and cowardice, deficiency. Generosity is the mean between prodigality, that is, spending recklessly, and being stingy. Aristotle carefully walked his students through many such examples. Temperance, that is, moderation, is a mean regarding pleasures of the body. Proper pride is a mean concerning one's honor, and so forth. But what is mean, or balanced depends on the situation and the person, which is why Aristotle says it's relative to us and must be decided as a wise person would decide in that case. Aristotle taught that virtues are acquired by habituation. We become just by doing just acts, brave by doing brave acts, much as one becomes a good piano player by practice or a good artist by practice. This was a very practical insight. Moral education is about training oneself to take pleasures in good behavior and be pained by bad behavior until virtuous action becomes second nature. But hold your horses. Virtue is not just a mindless habit. It requires using reason to navigate complex circumstance. Thus Aristotle held up the ideal of phronesis, or practical wisdom, which allows a person to discern the right course of action when principles conflict or situations are somewhat novel. The virtuous person, in Aristotle's teaching, is someone who has both the right dispositions partnered with the right judgment. But it might surprise a modern audience, quote unquote, that Aristotle's ethics are quite human-centered and flexible. He didn't lay down universal commandments or strict rules. Instead, he reasoned about the kinds of lives and actions that lead to genuine happiness. He recognized that context and moderation are key. For instance, truthfulness is a virtue, but the appropriate amount of frankness will differ if you're speaking to a friend or speaking to a hostile crowd. Too much honesty could be a vice of insensitivity. Too little of it becomes deceitful. This nuance is why Aristotle's ethics can feel very realistic and applicable. It's about cultivating character, so you generally don't hit the mean, the average, and do the right thing, rather than checking off a list of do's and don'ts. Another essential part of Aristotle's ethical teaching is his discussion of friendship, that is, philia. He devoted 2 whole books of the Nicomachean Ethics, that is, book 7 and book 8 and book 9 to friendship, which shows how important he thought it was in a good life. Aristotle taught that friendship is one of the greatest goods in life, and he distinguished types of friendships, those of utility based on mutual advantage, those of pleasure based on enjoyment of each other's company, and those of virtue based on mutual respect and goodness. The highest form, virtuous friendship, he described as 2 people who wished the good of the other for the other's own sake, share values, and help each other grow in virtue. To Aristotle, life is richer and more fulfilling with such friends. It's hard to disagree. No one would choose to live without friends, even if they had all of the other good things in the world. This emphasis on friendship adds a bit of a warm, human dimension to Aristotle's teaching. Ethics, they're not just about individual pursuits, but something that flourishes in community and relationships. Aristotle's ethics acknowledged the role of external goods and luck. He did believe virtue is the primary factor in happiness. A virtuous person will make the best of any situation. However, he was frank that severe misfortune can hurt one's ability to be happy. Quote from his work, "Happiness, then, is the best, noblest, and most pleasant thing in the world, and it is something final and self-sufficient." Yet, he immediately adds that external goods are needed too. Adequate wealth, family, health, and even good looks, that can affect one's happiness. A person constantly buffeted by extreme poverty or tragic loss might not attain eudaimonia through no fault of their own. Their circumstances are just too difficult. It's like trying to grow flowers in sand. That kind of thing. The conditions are just not ideal. Now, the sober recognition prevents Aristotle's teaching from being overly idealistic. It's grounded in how real life actually works. He encouraged virtuous living while understanding that chance and context certainly play their own roles in the outcome. Basically, he taught his students an ethical framework where the goal is a well-lived life of virtue, finding balance, guided by reason, and nurtured in friendship and community. It's a vision of ethics as an art of living, requiring judgment and practice. One can certainly imagine Aristotle in lecture asking his pupils to reflect on an example of virtues and vices in their own experience, all to sharpen their own moral insight. His approach was less about telling them what exactly to do in each scenario, and more about how to cultivate wisdom to figure that out themselves. So, let's get on to humans as political animals. We live in a society. Building on his ethics, Aristotle taught about politics, which he saw as closely intertwined with ethics. So if ethics is about the good of an individual, politics must be about the good of a community. In fact, Aristotle considered politics the master science in the practical realm, because a proper political arrangement creates the conditions for individuals to live good lives. Quite famously, he stated, "Man is by nature a political animal." What did he mean by that? Well, what he meant was human beings naturally form communities, the highest form being the city-state or polis, and that a fulfilled human life is one that is engaged in the civic life of a community. We are not solitary creatures. As much as people like to think that they are, well, everybody needs somebody every now and then. Perhaps there's exceptions, but it's very rare. We achieve our good in concert with others. And Aristotle pointed out that a person who is without a city-state, not by their own choice, is either a beast or a god, implying that living in a structured community is simply part of basic human nature. Unlike bees or ants, however, humans coordinate through rational speech and shared moral concepts like justice, ethics, things like this. This, Aristotle taught, is what makes our political communities unique from other animals. In his work, Politics, he examined different forms of government: monarchy, aristocracy, polity, which he considered good forms, and their corrupted versions: tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy, the bad forms, where those in power govern for selfish ends. Aristotle's approach was empirical and comparative. He analyzed constitutions of many Greek city-states, data all gathered by his school, to see what worked well, and of course, what worked poorly. He made a conclusion that a mixed government, elements of democracy and oligarchy balanced, often worked out the best way, and that the stability of a polis depended on a large middle class to avoid the extreme rich-poor divide. Though he personally favored a form of polity with virtuous, moderate citizens at the helm, Aristotle's teachings on politics was certainly not a one-size-fits-all. He recognized that the best practical government might vary based on circumstance, and he discussed education and laws that would keep a polis healthy. One interesting and rather progressive idea that Aristotle taught is that the city exists for the sake of living well, rather than merely living. The polis isn't just a pact for survival or economic trade. It is there to enable citizens to pursue virtue and happiness in a higher sense. This ties politics directly to ethics. A good state, for Aristotle, actively cultivates virtue in its citizens through education and laws. However, Aristotle also had some views that clash with modern sensibilities. For example, he defended with some unease the institution of slavery as natural for some people, and he had a hierarchical view of society, free men as full citizens, women and slaves in subservient roles. Pretty common views in his era. Though, even then, they were not entirely uncontested. Well, of course, the modern reader, unquote, can look at these aspects and critique them. But we're not walking in the modern era. We're talking about what Aristotle said, and we have to acknowledge them without too much judgment. Well, what was his reasoning? Well, the reasoning that Aristotle had was that some people lacked the rational capacity for self-governance, and thus were natural slaves, a concept that we firmly reject today on certain grounds, but it shows that Aristotle was a man of his time in certain respects. Still, much of Aristotle's political teaching was keenly insightful. He advocated the rule of law, reason impartially applied, over the rule of individual whims, and he warned against the extremes of wealth and poverty as destabilizing influences. He stressed the importance of education in shaping virtuous citizens, and he emphasized that humans find their highest fulfillment in contributing to a community, a lesson as relevant now as it was back then. Politics, in Aristotle's lectures, it wasn't a dirty business to avoid. It was a noble endeavor to organize society for the common good. He even saw the household, the oikos, as a foundational unit, and discussed household management and economics in the old sense of managing the home as preliminaries to politics. All these teachings would prepare his students, some of whom, like Aristotle's former student Alexander, would become great leaders, to think about governance, not just in terms of power, but in terms of virtue and the human good. So, it's really worth noting how his life intersected with his teachings before we move on. He personally experienced the political upheaval and the tensions of his identity as a Macedonian in Athens. After Alexander the Great's death, anti-Macedonian sentiment in Athens put Aristotle in danger due to his Macedonian connections. Well, rather than face prosecution as Socrates had, Aristotle fled Athens in 323 BC. He is said to have quipped that he left to prevent Athens from sinning twice against philosophy, the first sin being the execution of Socrates, of course. Well, even though Socrates technically executed himself, but, well, it's for another time, isn't it? This anecdote, whether uttered by Aristotle or attributed later, it shows how seriously Aristotle took the relationship between philosophy and the polis. It also shows him practicing a little bit of prudence, choosing exile over martyrdom. But he did die shortly after in exile. But his students in Athens, back in the Lyceum, continued under his successor, Theophrastus. Aristotle's political legacy, as with his philosophical one, would only grow in stature after his death. But hey, we're not done yet. Let's talk about art and rhetoric. Aristotle did not teach only about abstract philosophy and hard sciences. He was equally interested in art and communication. In his work Rhetoric, he analyzes the art of persuasion, and in his Poetics, he explores the art of poetry and drama, works showing another side of Aristotle's thought, attentive to language, storytelling, and the emotional effect on an audience. In the work Rhetoric, Aristotle defines rhetoric as the counterpart of dialectic. Now, what does he mean by this? Basically, it's a skill of reasoning aimed at persuasion, rather than a strict demonstration. He taught that rhetoric is not inherently bad or deceitful. Used properly, it's the art of finding the available means of persuasion in any given case. Aristotle identified 3 modes of persuasion that a speaker can appeal to. That is the logos, logical argument, ethos, the credibility or character of the speaker, and finally the pathos, the emotional state of the audience. A good speaker, he taught, weaves these together, presenting solid arguments, that logos, while appearing trustworthy and virtuous themselves, ethos, and engaging the listener's feelings appropriately, pathos. Aristotle systematically discussed how different audiences, like judges in court or citizens in an assembly, require their own approaches, and he even analyzed famous speeches to illustrate these points. Students learning rhetoric from Aristotle would gain very practical knowledge, how to construct a compelling argument, how to use examples, and enthymemes, a kind of rhetorical syllogism, and how to stir an audience without manipulating them unfairly. He essentially taught rhetoric as a necessary skill for anyone in public life, much as we teach public speaking and composition today. The Poetics is Aristotle's study of literary art, especially tragedy, those serious dramas performed on stage in ancient Greece. He asks the question, what makes a good tragedy? What elements do these stories have? In answering, he effectively founded literary theory. He taught that tragedy is an imitation of an action. By imitation, mimesis, he meant something like representation. He believed humans are naturally imitative creatures and learn by imitation from childhood, and that we take pleasure in imitations, even of things painful in real life, because we enjoy learning and contemplating such representations. And this was a remarkable insight. People can enjoy the sadness of a tragic play, because through art we find that meaning and recognition, and we can kind of ignore the raw emotion aspect of it. Aristotle broke tragedy into components: plot, character, diction, thought, spectacle, and song, and ranked plot as the most important. He taught that a good plot should have a beginning, middle, and end, with events following logically and inevitably, usually involving a reversal and recognition. For example, the hero falls from fortune and realizes some hard truths about their situation. All this is structured to evoke pity and fear, and through these emotions affect a catharsis, meaning a purification or purgation of those feelings in the audience. Exactly what Aristotle meant by catharsis has been debated for centuries, but in essence, he suggested that watching tragedy can be emotionally beneficial to the spectators, allowing them to experience and release intense feelings in a controlled environment. In fact, one of Aristotle's interesting teachings in the Poetics is his defense of poetry as philosophically valuable. Plato had famously criticized poets, and even wanted to exclude them from his ideal republic, seeing them as imitators of appearances who could corrupt the morality of people. Aristotle, however, argued that poetry, and of course by extension drama, can show universal truths in a way that history simply cannot. He wrote, "Poetry is more philosophical and more elevated than history, because history just recounts what happened, whereas poetry shows the kinds of things that could happen. It deals with universals, not particulars. This is a powerful argument for the importance of imagination and storytelling. Through well-crafted plots and characters, an audience learns about general human nature and ethics, perhaps more effectively than through abstract lessons. Aristotle was teaching that art has its own kind of knowledge and insight to offer. And so, in discussing epic poetry and tragedy, Aristotle also touched on the importance of unity and coherent theme, concepts that would influence literary criticism all the way up to our modern times. But he had a practical streak too. He advised that playwrights construct their plots in a way that if any part is removed or rearranged, the whole would be disturbed, anticipating what we'd call narrative integrity, I suppose. All these points show Aristotle applying his logical and empirical mindset to the realm of art. He observed many plays, identified patterns of success or failure, and drew general principles. A student in Aristotle's day, listening to his lectures on tragedy, might come away not only with a deeper appreciation of Euripides or Sophocles, but also with a sense of how art and psychology intersect. Well, as we reach the end, it's quite nuanced. In a single hour, or a single treatise, one could only scratch the surface of what Aristotle really taught. The surviving works span logic, natural science, metaphysics, ethics, politics, aesthetics, rhetoric, and within each, they brim with detailed arguments and observations. But stepping back, we do see a unified vision. Aristotle taught his followers to seek understanding of the world in its fullness. He believed that the universe is a place of order and purpose, that human reason, if disciplined, can grasp why things are the way they are, and that knowledge and virtue go hand in hand, leading a fulfilling life. And I hope you're well and truly fulfilled by what you've listened to today. It's been interesting, hasn't it? Old Aristotle. Well, I'd like to thank my top-tier patrons and supporters. Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Carey, Charlene, Lynn Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfenir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talvery, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, and Gukububonik. Still not sure if I'm saying that right. Well, that's it from me today, or tonight, whatever time you're listening from. And I think we can all go and have a little bit of a rest and meditate on what we've learned. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all.